From Sargon's bold Akkadians to today's far-reaching American influence, this is a calm yet epic journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with how a former cupbearer fused rival city-states into history's first empire, and move deeper into why movies, money, and microchips can bind nations without a single crown. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Akkadian Empire. Picture this. It's around 2334 BCE, and somewhere in the dusty corridors of a Sumerian palace, a cupbearer named Sargon is pouring wine for his king. But Sargon has bigger plans than serving drinks for the rest of eternity. Much bigger plans. Within a few short years, this humble servant would transform himself into the ruler of the world's first true empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. The Akkadian Empire wasn't just another ancient kingdom that happened to get lucky in a few battles. No, this was something entirely new under the sun. For the first time in human history, someone had figured out how to hold together dozens of different cities, tribes, and peoples under a single crown. Sargon didn't just conquer territories and then go home to count his loot. He stayed, he built, he created something that would last. The secret sauce? Innovation on multiple fronts. First, Sargon created the world's first professional standing army. Instead of relying on farmers who picked up spears when trouble came calling, he maintained a permanent force of trained soldiers. These weren't weekend warriors. They were career military men who ate, slept, and breathed warfare. This gave the Akkadians a massive advantage over their neighbors, who were still operating with part-time militias. But military might alone doesn't build empires. Sargon understood that conquest is only half the battle. The real challenge is keeping everything together afterward. So he pioneered something equally revolutionary: imperial infrastructure. The Akkadians built the first systematic network of roads connecting their territories, allowing rapid communication and troop movement across vast distances. Messages that once took weeks to deliver could now travel in days. Even more clever was their linguistic strategy. The Akkadians spoke a Semitic language, quite different from the Sumerian tongues of the cities they conquered. Rather than forcing everyone to abandon their local languages entirely, they established Akkadian as the lingua franca, the common tongue of trade, diplomacy, and administration. This created unity without completely destroying local identity, a delicate balance that many later empires would struggle to achieve. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, took things even further, declaring himself a living god and styling himself as king of the four quarters, essentially claiming dominion over the entire known world. The Akkadians developed a sophisticated bureaucratic system, with governors appointed to oversee distant provinces and regular reports flowing back to the capital. They standardized weights and measures across their territory, making trade more efficient and binding their empire together through economic integration. For nearly 2 centuries, this system worked brilliantly. The Akkadian Empire became the beating heart of Mesopotamian civilization, facilitating trade routes that stretched from Afghanistan to Egypt. Their scribes preserved and transmitted the literary traditions of Sumer, ensuring that masterpieces like the Epic of Gilgamesh would survive for future generations. Their artists developed new styles that blended Sumerian and Semitic influences, creating a distinctive imperial aesthetic. But empires, as we'll see again and again in this story, have a way of carrying the seeds of their own destruction. The Akkadian Empire fell victim to what historians call the imperial overstretch. They simply tried to control too much territory with too few resources. Managing an empire spanning hundreds of miles required constant vigilance, massive bureaucratic machinery, and endless military campaigns to suppress rebellions. Around 2200 BCE, everything started falling apart at once. A severe drought hit the region, causing widespread famine and economic collapse. Archaeological evidence suggests that this wasn't just a bad harvest year, it was a multi-decade climate catastrophe that undermined the agricultural foundation of Akkadian power. Starving populations don't make for loyal subjects, and rebellions erupted across the empire. Meanwhile, the Gutians, a hill people from the Zagros Mountains, began launching increasingly bold raids into Mesopotamian heartland. These weren't the kind of organized invasions that the Akkadian military was designed to handle. They were fast-moving guerrilla attacks that struck quickly and melted away before reinforcements arrived. The professional army that had been so effective at conquest proved less adaptable to this new kind of warfare. The final blow came from within. Succession disputes weakened the royal family, and provincial governors began acting more like independent kings than loyal administrators. The centralized system that had been the empire's greatest strength became its fatal weakness when the center could no longer hold. By 2154 BCE, the Akkadian Empire had crumbled completely, its territories fragmenting back into independent city-states, but its legacy lived on. The Akkadians had proven that vast multi-ethnic empires were possible, and they'd developed many of the basic tools: professional armies, bureaucratic administration, infrastructure networks, linguistic policies that future empire builders would refine and expand upon. Old and Middle Kingdom Egypt. While Mesopotamia was experimenting with empire building, Egypt was taking a completely different approach to creating lasting civilization. Instead of conquering distant lands, the Egyptians focused on perfecting their control over one of the world's most remarkable geographical features, the Nile River. What they built along its banks would outlast every other ancient civilization, persisting through millennia when empires that seemed far more powerful had crumbled to dust. The story of Egyptian greatness begins around 3100 BCE, when a legendary king named Menes unified Upper and Lower Egypt, but it really hits its stride during the Old Kingdom period, starting around 2686 BCE. This is when the Egyptians developed their most distinctive and enduring innovation, the concept of divine kingship. The pharaoh wasn't just a political ruler, he was literally a god walking among mortals, the earthly embodiment of Horus and the son of Ra. This wasn't mere royal propaganda. The Egyptians genuinely believed their king was divine, and this belief transformed everything about how their society functioned. When a god-king gives you an order, you don't negotiate or form committees to discuss alternatives, you obey. This created a level of centralized authority that made even the Akkadian Empire look loosely organized by comparison. The practical genius of Egyptian civilization lay in their mastery of the Nile's annual flood cycle. Every summer, the river would overflow its banks, depositing nutrient-rich silt across the fields and providing the water necessary for agriculture in an otherwise desert environment. The Egyptians learned to predict, channel, and maximize this natural phenomenon with remarkable precision. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems, built canals and dikes, and maintained detailed records of flood levels that allowed them to plan years in advance. This agricultural abundance supported something unprecedented, a massive population of people who didn't have to spend all their time growing food. Instead, they could specialize in crafts, administration, construction, and art. The result was an explosion of monumental architecture that still takes your breath away today. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 2580 BCE for Pharaoh Khufu, required an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing over 15 tons each, all fitted together with mathematical precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate. But the pyramids weren't just impressive construction projects. They were the physical manifestation of Egyptian theology and political philosophy. Each pyramid represented the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife, where he would continue to rule as a god among gods. The elaborate mummification process, the treasure-filled burial chambers, the detailed instructions carved into pyramid walls, all of this was designed to ensure that divine kingship would continue beyond death. The administrative system that made these massive projects possible was equally impressive. Egyptian scribes developed a sophisticated bureaucracy that kept detailed records of everything from tax collection to grain storage to the number of workers assigned to pyramid construction. They created the world's first comprehensive census system, tracking population, livestock, and agricultural output across the entire kingdom. This wasn't just bookkeeping, it was statecraft on a level that wouldn't be matched until the Roman Empire. The Middle Kingdom period, roughly 2055 to 1650 BCE, represented Egyptian civilization at its most confident and expansive. Having survived the chaos of the First Intermediate Period, when central authority temporarily collapsed, the Egyptians had learned valuable lessons about maintaining stability. They developed more sophisticated military organizations, expanded trade networks that reached as far as Afghanistan and Somalia, and refined their artistic and literary traditions to new heights of sophistication. Egyptian literature from this period reveals a remarkably mature and philosophical worldview. Works like The Tale of Sinuhe and The Admonitions of Ipuwer grapple with themes of justice, social responsibility, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. These weren't crude propaganda pieces. They were sophisticated explorations of political and moral philosophy that influenced thinking throughout the ancient Near East. But perhaps most remarkably, Egyptian civilization demonstrated an incredible capacity for cultural continuity across political disruptions. When the central government collapsed during intermediate periods, local governors maintained Egyptian traditions, art styles, and administrative practices. When unity was restored, these elements could be seamlessly reintegrated into a renewed national culture. This resilience allowed Egyptian civilization to persist through conquest by Hyksos, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, always maintaining its distinctive identity. The secret was that Egyptian culture wasn't just imposed from above, it was deeply internalized by the population. The annual Nile flood created a shared rhythm of life that bound all Egyptians together. The hieroglyphic writing system, with its combination of practical and sacred elements, made literacy feel like participation in divine mysteries. The elaborate religious calendar, with its festivals and rituals marking agricultural seasons, created a sense of cosmic order that transcended political changes. Even when foreign conquerors took over Egypt, they found themselves adopting Egyptian customs, art styles, and even religious beliefs. The Ptolemaic Greeks, who ruled Egypt after Alexander's conquest, became more Egyptian than Greek over time. The Romans, despite their military superiority, were fascinated by Egyptian wisdom and incorporated Egyptian gods into their own pantheon. This cultural staying power was Egypt's greatest achievement. While military empires rose and fell, leaving behind ruins and legends, Egyptian civilization created something deeper, a way of life so compelling and sophisticated that it could survive almost anything history threw at it. The pyramids still stand today not just because they were built well, but because they represent ideas about human potential, divine authority, and cosmic order that continue to resonate across millennia. Hittite Empire. Up in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, while Egypt was perfecting the art of divine kingship and Mesopotamia was cycling through various attempts at empire, another group was quietly developing innovations that would change warfare, diplomacy, and metallurgy forever. The Hittites weren't the most famous ancient civilization. They don't have pyramids or ziggurats to mark their territory, but they were arguably the most technologically advanced people of the Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire emerged around 1600 BCE in what's now central Turkey, and from the beginning, they were different. Where other ancient powers relied on overwhelming numbers or divine authority to maintain control, the Hittites succeeded through superior technology and surprisingly modern approaches to governance. They were the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, constantly innovating, adapting, and finding clever solutions to complex problems. Their first breakthrough was metallurgical. The Hittites were among the earliest masters of ironworking, developing techniques for smelting and forging iron weapons that gave them a significant military advantage over enemies still relying on bronze. This wasn't just about having sharper swords. Iron was much more abundant than the tin needed for bronze production, meaning the Hittites could equip larger armies more cheaply and reliably than their competitors. But they didn't stop there. The Hittites revolutionized chariot warfare, developing lighter, more maneuverable vehicles that could carry 3 men instead of the traditional 2. Their chariots featured improved wheel design, better suspension systems, and more effective harness arrangements that allowed for faster speeds and tighter turns in battle. When Hittite chariot formations thundered across a battlefield, they moved with a coordination and effectiveness that terrified their enemies. What really set the Hittites apart, however, was their approach to diplomacy and international relations. They were the first civilization to systematically develop what we would recognize today as international law. The Hittites negotiated detailed treaties with their neighbors, establishing clear borders, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts. They maintained diplomatic archives filled with correspondence between kings, creating a paper trail of international relations that historians still study today. The most famous example is the Treaty of Kadesh, signed around 1259 BCE between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. This wasn't just a ceasefire agreement, it was a comprehensive peace treaty that established diplomatic protocols, prisoner exchange procedures, and mutual assistance clauses. Copies were made in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, and versions have been found in both countries' archives. It's literally the world's first documented international peace treaty. The Hittites were also remarkably pragmatic about governance. Instead of trying to impose a unified culture across their empire, they developed a decentralized system that allowed conquered territories to maintain their local customs and rulers, as long as they paid tribute and provided military support when requested. This vassal system was much more flexible than the direct rule favored by other empires, and it allowed the Hittites to control a much larger territory with fewer resources. Their capital city, Hattusa, was a marvel of Bronze Age urban planning. Built on a naturally fortified hilltop, it featured massive stone walls with innovative gate designs, sophisticated water management systems, and impressive royal palaces decorated with elaborate relief sculptures. The city's archives contained thousands of cuneiform tablets, recording everything from royal correspondence to religious rituals to legal proceedings, providing historians with an incredibly detailed picture of Hittite society. Religion played a central role in Hittite culture, but even here they showed their characteristic pragmatism. The Hittites worshipped a storm god as their primary deity, which made sense for people living in a mountainous region where weather patterns could make or break agricultural seasons. But they also incorporated gods from conquered territories into their pantheon, creating a remarkably diverse and inclusive religious system. This theological flexibility helped reduce religious tensions in their multi-ethnic empire. The Hittites were also legal innovators, developing one of the world's first comprehensive legal codes. Unlike the harsh punishments prescribed by earlier codes like Hammurabi's, Hittite law emphasized restitution over retribution. Instead of an eye for an eye, Hittite justice focused on compensating victims and restoring social harmony. Their legal system included provisions for women's rights, property disputes, and even early forms of environmental protection. For over 4 centuries, this system worked brilliantly. The Hittite Empire became one of the great powers of the ancient world, competing with Egypt and Assyria for influence throughout the Near East. Their armies won spectacular victories, their diplomats negotiated favorable treaties, and their merchants facilitated trade networks that stretched from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. But like all ancient empires, the Hittites carried within them the seeds of their own destruction. Their decentralized system, while flexible, made them vulnerable when central authority weakened. Around 1200 BCE, a perfect storm of disasters struck the eastern Mediterranean: widespread drought, internal succession disputes, and the mysterious invasions of the Sea Peoples, maritime raiders who attacked coastal settlements throughout the region. The Hittite Empire, despite all its technological and organizational advantages, couldn't cope with multiple simultaneous crises. Provincial governors declared independence, the capital was abandoned, and the great Hittite war machine simply fell apart. By 1178 BCE, the empire had completely collapsed, leaving behind only scattered city-states and the memory of their innovations. But those innovations lived on. Ironworking techniques spread throughout the ancient world, ushering in the Iron Age. Diplomatic practices pioneered by the Hittites became standard throughout the Near East. Their legal concepts influenced later law codes, and their flexible approach to imperial governance provided a model that future empires would study and adapt. The Hittites proved that technological innovation and sophisticated governance could create a great empire, but they also demonstrated that even the most advanced civilizations remain vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Neo-Assyrian Empire. If the Hittites were the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, then the Neo-Assyrians were its Sparta, a civilization that turned warfare into both an art and a science, creating the most efficient military machine the world had ever seen. From their heartland in northern Mesopotamia, the Assyrians built an empire that stretched from Egypt to Iran, held together not by shared culture or economic benefits, but by the simple, terrifying reality that resistance was futile. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which dominated the Near East from roughly 911 to 609 BCE, represented a completely different approach to imperial expansion. Where earlier empires often grew through gradual conquest and incorporation, the Assyrians perfected the art of shock and awe. They didn't just defeat their enemies, they systematically destroyed the very possibility of future resistance through techniques so ruthlessly effective that they still make historians uncomfortable. At the heart of Assyrian success was military professionalism taken to its logical extreme. The Assyrian army wasn't just a collection of warriors, it was a complex, hierarchical organization with specialized units, standardized equipment, and systematic training programs. They developed the world's first true military-industrial complex, with entire cities dedicated to producing weapons, siege engines, and military supplies. Their siege warfare capabilities were particularly revolutionary. The Assyrians invented or perfected most of the siege techniques that would dominate warfare for the next 1,000 years. Battering rams mounted on wheeled platforms, siege towers that could overtop city walls, undermining techniques that could collapse fortifications, and even early forms of psychological warfare designed to break enemy morale before the physical assault began. But the Assyrians' most notorious innovation was their systematic use of terror as a tool of statecraft. They didn't just kill their enemies, they made public spectacles of their deaths, creating elaborate torture and execution scenes designed to spread fear throughout the region. Assyrian royal reliefs, carved on palace walls, depicted graphic scenes of impalement, flaying, and mass deportations, serving as both artistic achievement and propaganda warning to potential rebels. The deportation system was particularly effective. Instead of simply killing conquered populations, the Assyrians would forcibly relocate entire communities to distant parts of their empire, breaking up existing social structures and making organized resistance nearly impossible. Hundreds of thousands of people were uprooted from their ancestral homes and scattered across the empire, creating a vast pool of displaced labor while eliminating potential sources of rebellion. This system was administered through what was perhaps the most sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus of the ancient world. The Assyrian Empire was divided into provinces governed by appointed officials who reported directly to the king through a complex hierarchy of administrators, military commanders, and intelligence networks. Royal messengers traveled constantly throughout the empire, carrying orders from the capital and bringing back detailed reports on local conditions. The Assyrians were also great preservers and cataloguers of knowledge. The royal library at Nineveh, assembled by King Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, contained over 30 cuneiform tablets covering everything from literature and mathematics to medicine and astronomy. This wasn't just royal collecting, it was a systematic attempt to preserve the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamian civilization. Thanks to Assyrian scribes, we have complete versions of works like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish creation myth. Their capital cities were monuments to imperial power on a scale that dwarfed anything built before. Nineveh, at its height, may have been home to over 100 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The royal palaces featured massive stone sculptures of winged bulls and lions, elaborate relief carvings depicting royal hunts and military campaigns, and throne rooms designed to overwhelm visitors with displays of wealth and power. The Assyrians also developed sophisticated systems of imperial propaganda. Royal inscriptions were carved in multiple languages and distributed throughout the empire, proclaiming the king's victories and divine mandate to rule. These weren't just historical records. They were carefully crafted political messages designed to reinforce Assyrian authority and discourage resistance. For nearly 3 centuries, this system worked with terrifying efficiency. Assyrian armies campaigned every year, constantly expanding the empire's borders while suppressing rebellions in already conquered territories. They defeated Egypt, conquered Babylon, and reduced formerly great powers to vassal states paying tribute to Nineveh. But the very effectiveness of the Assyrian system contained the seeds of its own destruction. An empire built purely on fear and military force requires constant success to maintain credibility. Any sign of weakness invites rebellion, and rebellions in such a system tend to be particularly vicious, since conquered peoples have little hope of mercy if they fail. The Assyrians also fell victim to imperial overstretch on a massive scale. By the 7th century BCE, they were trying to control territories from Egypt to Iran, a vast area that required enormous military resources to patrol and defend. The constant warfare that had built the empire was now draining it, as more and more troops were needed just to maintain existing conquests rather than make new ones. The end came with shocking swiftness. In 626 BCE, Babylonia rebelled under Nabopolassar, who formed an alliance with the Medes of Iran. The combined Babylonian-Median army besieged Nineveh for 3 years before finally breaching its walls in 612 BCE. The destruction was so complete that the great Assyrian capital disappeared almost entirely from history. Its ruins weren't definitively identified by archaeologists until the 19th century. The last Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit II, attempted to maintain a rump state in western Syria with Egyptian support, but this final remnant was crushed at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE. The Assyrian Empire, which had seemed invincible for centuries, simply ceased to exist. Yet the Assyrians' legacy lived on in the administrative and military techniques they had pioneered. The Persian Empire that succeeded them adopted many Assyrian governmental practices, and their systematic approach to record-keeping preserved invaluable information about ancient Near Eastern civilization. Even their reputation for ruthlessness served a historical purpose. They demonstrated both the possibilities and the ultimate limitations of building an empire through force alone. ACHAEMENID Persian Empire. After the Assyrians showed the world what happened when an empire relied purely on terror and military might, the stage was set for someone to try a completely different approach. That someone was Cyrus the Great of Persia, and the empire he founded would become the largest and most successful the ancient world had ever seen, not through superior brutality, but through a revolutionary combination of tolerance, administrative genius, and strategic flexibility that modern political scientists still study today. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which lasted from roughly 550 to 330 BCE, represented a complete rejection of the Assyrian model. Where the Assyrians had ruled through fear, the Persians governed through accommodation. Where the Assyrians had sought to crush local cultures, the Persians celebrated diversity. Where the Assyrians had created a vast prison of subject peoples, the Persians built what they called a Garden of Nations, a multi-ethnic, multicultural commonwealth that spanned 3 continents. Cyrus the Great's rise to power began in the highlands of Fars, in what's now southern Iran, where the Persian tribes had been vassals of the Median Empire. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus led a successful rebellion against his Median overlords, but instead of simply replacing one Iranian dynasty with another, he embarked on a series of conquests that would reshape the ancient world. Within 20 years, he had conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia, captured the great city of Babylon, and established Persian rule from the Aegean Sea to the Hindu Kush Mountains. But Cyrus's real genius wasn't military, it was political. His conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE provides a perfect example of the Persian approach. Instead of destroying the city and deporting its population, as the Assyrians would have done, Cyrus entered Babylon as a liberator. He freed the Jewish exiles who had been held there since Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem, allowed them to return home and rebuild their temple, and issued what historians call the Cyrus Cylinder, a declaration of religious freedom and cultural autonomy that some consider the world's first charter of human rights. This wasn't just good public relations. It was sophisticated statecraft. By positioning themselves as liberators rather than conquerors, the Persians turned potential rebels into grateful subjects. Instead of spending vast resources suppressing constant rebellions, they could focus on expansion and development. The energy that other empires wasted on internal security could be channeled into more productive activities. The administrative system that held this vast empire together was equally revolutionary. The Persians divided their territory into satrapies, provinces governed by appointed satraps who enjoyed considerable local autonomy as long as they collected taxes, maintained order, and provided troops when requested. This system allowed for remarkable flexibility, as different regions could be governed according to their own traditions and customs, while still contributing to the imperial project. The famous Royal Road, stretching over 600 miles from Sardis to Susa, exemplified Persian administrative efficiency. This wasn't just a highway, it was a comprehensive communication system with relay stations, fresh horses, and professional messengers who could carry imperial dispatches across the empire in a matter of days rather than months. The Greeks marveled that a message could travel from one end of the Persian Empire to the other faster than news could cross much smaller Greek territories. Persian religious policy was equally sophisticated. Instead of imposing their own Zoroastrian beliefs on conquered peoples, the Persians actively supported local religions and funded the restoration of temples that previous conquerors had destroyed. This wasn't mere tolerance, it was recognition that religious diversity could strengthen rather than weaken imperial unity, as long as it was properly managed. The Persian court developed into something unprecedented in ancient history, a truly international ruling class. Persian nobles served alongside Babylonian administrators, Greek mercenaries fought in Persian armies, and Egyptian architects designed Persian palaces. The great ceremonial capital at Persepolis featured architectural elements and artistic motifs from across the empire, creating a visual representation of Persian universalism. Under Darius I, who ruled from 522 to 486 BCE, the Persian system reached its full development. Darius codified Persian law, standardized weights and measures across the empire, and introduced a common currency, the gold daric, that facilitated trade from India to Egypt. He also commissioned the construction of magnificent royal roads, palace complexes, and irrigation systems that demonstrated Persian engineering capabilities. But perhaps most importantly, Darius articulated the ideological foundation of Persian rule in his famous inscription at Behistun Rock. Carved in 3 languages, Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite. This monument proclaimed that Darius ruled by the favor of Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian supreme deity, but that his authority extended over all peoples regardless of their religious beliefs. This was a revolutionary concept, imperial legitimacy based not on ethnic supremacy or divine kingship, but on moral authority and effective governance. The Persian Empire's greatest test came through its conflicts with the Greek city-states. Beginning with the Ionian Revolt in 499 BCE, and continuing through the famous Persian Wars that ended with Greek victories at Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. These conflicts weren't just military campaigns, they represented a clash between 2 completely different models of political organization: Persian universalism versus Greek particularism, imperial accommodation versus city-state independence. Despite their ultimate failure to conquer Greece, the Persians demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. They learned from their defeats, reformed their military systems, and continued to play a major role in Greek affairs through diplomacy, bribery, and selective intervention. The Persian Empire remained the dominant power in the Near East for another century and a half after the Greek victories. The end finally came through Alexander of Macedon's invasion in 334 BCE, but even here, the Persian legacy proved remarkably durable. Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, but he also absorbed many of its governmental practices, adopted Persian court ceremonies, and attempted to create a fusion culture that combined Greek and Persian elements. His successors, the Hellenistic kings, continued to rule their territories using administrative systems originally developed by the Persians. The Achaemenid Persian Empire proved that tolerance, accommodation, and respect for local traditions could be just as effective as terror and oppression in building and maintaining imperial power. Their model of governance influenced every subsequent empire, from Alexander's Hellenistic kingdoms to the Roman Empire to the Islamic caliphates. They showed that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness, and that successful empires needed to be gardeners rather than conquerors, cultivating the best in human civilization rather than simply crushing opposition. Classical Athens, the Delian League. While the Persian Empire was demonstrating how tolerance and accommodation could build a vast continental empire, a small collection of Greek city-states across the Aegean Sea was experimenting with something completely different, the idea that ordinary citizens could govern themselves. Athens, a city that could fit comfortably inside a single Persian province, was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful empires aren't built on territory or population, but on ideas so compelling that they reshape human civilization forever. The Athenian Empire began almost by accident. In 478 BCE, following the Greek victories over Persia, Athens found itself the natural leader of a defensive alliance called the Delian League. The original purpose was simple: pool resources to prevent future Persian invasions and liberate Greek cities still under Persian control. What started as a mutual defense pact gradually transformed into something unprecedented, a naval empire built on democratic ideals, funded by tribute, and held together by the most powerful fleet the Mediterranean had ever seen. The foundation of Athenian power was the trireme, a sleek, fast warship powered by 170 rowers sitting in 3 tiers. These weren't just boats, they were precision instruments of naval warfare, capable of ramming enemy vessels with bronze, reinforced prows, or outmaneuvering larger ships through superior speed and agility. At its height, Athens maintained a fleet of nearly 300 triremes, representing an investment in naval technology that dwarfed anything attempted by previous civilizations. But the real innovation wasn't technological, it was political. Athens had developed the world's first radical democracy, where ordinary citizens could participate directly in government decisions through the ecclesia, popular assembly. This wasn't representative democracy as we know it today, but direct democracy where any citizen could speak, propose laws, and vote on issues affecting the entire community. The psychological impact was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, ordinary people felt they had genuine control over their own political destiny. This democratic energy translated into military effectiveness in ways that surprised everyone, including the Athenians themselves. When citizens fought for a government they had helped create, they fought with an intensity and commitment that professional armies couldn't match. The Athenian citizen soldier wasn't just following orders, he was defending a political system that gave him unprecedented personal freedom and dignity. The wealth that funded this democracy came from tribute paid by league members, but as Athens grew more powerful, the distinction between voluntary contributions and forced taxation became increasingly blurred. By the 450s BCE, Athens was openly treating league members as subject states, moving the league treasury from the neutral island of Delos to Athens itself, and using tribute money to fund massive construction projects in their own city. The Periclean Age, named after the statesman Pericles, who dominated Athenian politics from 461 to 429 BCE, represented the height of this democratic empire. Using league funds, Athens embarked on an unprecedented building program that created some of the most beautiful architecture in human history. The Parthenon, completed in 438 BCE, wasn't just a temple to Athena, it was a statement in marble about the power and sophistication of democratic civilization. But the Parthenon was only the most famous element of a comprehensive urban renewal project that transformed Athens into the cultural capital of the Greek world. The city attracted philosophers like Socrates, playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides, historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, and artists whose works still define our understanding of classical beauty. This wasn't accidental. Democratic Athens consciously positioned itself as the school of Greece, using cultural achievement as a form of soft power that complemented their naval dominance. The Athenian system created an extraordinary paradox: a democracy that ruled an empire, a city that preached freedom while extracting tribute from subject states, a civilization that celebrated individual liberty while denying it to slaves and foreigners. This tension between democratic ideals at home and imperial coercion abroad would ultimately prove unsustainable, but for nearly a century it produced the most creative and dynamic society the ancient world had ever seen. Athenian democracy was far from perfect by modern standards. Citizenship was limited to adult males born to Athenian parents, excluding women, slaves, and foreign residents who made up the majority of the city's population. The democratic assembly could be swayed by demagogues, make impulsive decisions, and even vote to ostracize prominent citizens for 10 years without trial. Yet within these limitations, Athens created a political culture that valued debate, critical thinking, and individual achievement in ways that would influence Western civilization for millennia. The empire's naval character shaped both its strengths and weaknesses. Control of the sea allowed Athens to maintain trade routes, collect tribute, and project power across vast distances with relatively small forces. But naval empires are inherently fragile. They depend on maintaining technological superiority and can collapse rapidly if their fleet is destroyed or their financial resources are exhausted. The beginning of the end came with the Peloponnesian War, which began in 431 BCE as a conflict between Athens and Sparta, but eventually drew in most of the Greek world. The war revealed the fundamental contradictions in the Athenian system, a democracy that had to act imperially to fund its democratic institutions, a city that preached liberation while practicing coercion, an empire built on ideas that ultimately couldn't overcome the material realities of prolonged warfare. The disastrous Sicilian expedition of 415–413 BCE epitomized these contradictions. Athens launched a massive invasion of Sicily, ostensibly to help their allies, but really to expand their empire and capture new sources of tribute. The expedition ended in complete disaster, with the destruction of 2 entire fleets and the loss of thousands of Athenian citizens. The defeat shattered Athenian naval supremacy and revealed the empire's underlying weakness. The final blow came in 405 BCE at the Battle of Aegospotami, where the Spartan fleet, funded by Persian gold, destroyed the remaining Athenian navy. Without their ships, Athens could no longer control their empire, or even feed their own population. The city surrendered in 404 BCE, and the Delian League was dissolved. Yet the Athenian experiment left a legacy that far outlasted their political empire. The idea that ordinary citizens could govern themselves, that democracy was not only possible but superior to other forms of government, that individual freedom and collective responsibility could coexist. These concepts would resurface again and again throughout history, inspiring later democratic movements and revolutions. Athens proved that empires could be built on more than just military force or administrative efficiency. They showed that ideas could be as powerful as armies, that cultural achievement could create lasting influence, and that even a small state could change the world if it developed political and intellectual innovations that captured the human imagination. Macedonian Empire of Alexander. In 336 BCE, a 20-year-old prince named Alexander inherited the throne of Macedonia, a rough kingdom on the northern fringes of the Greek world that most southerners considered barely civilized. 12 years later, this same young man had conquered an empire stretching from Egypt to India, fundamentally reshaping the ancient world and creating a new form of civilization that blended Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian elements into something unprecedented in human history. Alexander's empire was built on foundations laid by his father, Philip II, who had spent decades transforming Macedonia from a backward tribal kingdom into the most formidable military power in Greece. Philip revolutionized warfare through innovations that would define military tactics for centuries: the Macedonian phalanx, featuring 16-foot-long sarissas, pikes, that could outreach any opposing infantry, the systematic use of siege engines to reduce fortified cities, and the integration of heavy cavalry, infantry, and light troops into a flexible combined arms force. But Philip's greatest innovation was creating the first truly professional army in European history. Unlike the citizen militias of the Greek city-states or the conscript armies of other kingdoms, the Macedonian military consisted of full-time soldiers who trained constantly, served for extended campaigns, and developed an almost religious devotion to their commanders. This wasn't just an army, it was a military brotherhood bound together by shared hardships, mutual loyalty, and the promise of wealth and glory through conquest. When Alexander took command of this war machine, he immediately demonstrated that he had inherited not only his father's military genius, but also something uniquely his own, an almost supernatural ability to inspire absolute devotion in his troops and a vision of conquest that transcended anything attempted by previous rulers. His first campaigns in Greece and the Balkans revealed a young king who combined strategic brilliance with tactical flexibility, diplomatic skill with ruthless determination. The invasion of Asia began in 334 BCE with just 35,000 men, a tiny force by Persian standards, but one that would prove unstoppable. Alexander's first major victory at the Granicus River announced his arrival as a conqueror of genius, but it was his triumph at Issus in 333 BCE that truly established his legend. Facing Darius III and the full might of the Persian Empire, Alexander led a cavalry charge that shattered the Persian center and sent the great king fleeing from the battlefield. What followed was a campaign of breathtaking audacity and scope. Alexander conquered the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Gaza through innovative siege warfare, was crowned pharaoh in Egypt, where he founded the city of Alexandria, destroyed the Persian ceremonial capital at Persepolis, and pursued Darius across the Iranian plateau until the Persian king was murdered by his own satraps. By 330 BCE, the Achaemenid Empire, which had dominated the Near East for 2 centuries, had simply ceased to exist. But Alexander wasn't content with merely conquering the Persian Empire. He wanted to transform it. Unlike previous conquerors who imposed their own culture on subject peoples, Alexander attempted to create a genuine fusion civilization that would combine the best elements of Greek and Persian traditions. He adopted Persian court ceremonies, married Persian princesses, and encouraged his officers to do the same. He retained Persian administrators in their positions, incorporated Persian units into his army, and began planning cities that would serve as melting pots for Greek and Asian cultures. The most famous of these new cities was Alexandria in Egypt, but Alexander founded dozens of others throughout his empire, all designed to serve as centers of Greek culture and learning while remaining integrated into local economies and societies. These weren't colonial outposts, but genuine hybrid communities where Greek veterans settled alongside local populations, creating new forms of art, literature, philosophy, and religion that would define the Hellenistic world for centuries. Alexander's conquests in Central Asia and India revealed both his military genius and the growing strains within his expedition. The campaigns beyond the Oxus River involved fighting in mountainous terrain against skilled guerrilla opponents who had never been successfully conquered by any previous empire. Alexander's victories here required innovations in mountain warfare, siegecraft, and logistics that pushed his army to its absolute limits. The invasion of India represented the culmination of Alexander's ambitions and the beginning of his downfall. His victory over King Porus at the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE was perhaps his greatest tactical achievement, involving a complex river crossing, cavalry maneuvers, and elephant warfare in monsoon conditions. But the psychological cost was enormous. His troops had been campaigning for 8 years, had traveled thousands of miles from home, and were increasingly reluctant to follow their king into unknown territories. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River marked the only time Alexander's will was successfully challenged by his own men. Faced with the prospect of further campaigns in India, the Macedonian army simply refused to continue. Alexander's rage was legendary, but he eventually accepted the inevitable and began the long journey back to Babylon, which would become the capital of his new empire. The administrative challenge of ruling 3 continents with a relatively small Macedonian elite forced Alexander to become increasingly innovative in his governmental approaches. He began developing new forms of royal authority that blended Macedonian, Persian, and divine elements, experimenting with bureaucratic systems that could function across vast cultural and linguistic divides, and creating military units that combined soldiers from different ethnic backgrounds. But these innovations also created tensions that Alexander never fully resolved. Many Macedonians resented his adoption of Persian customs and his attempts to place Asians on equal footing with Greeks. Persian nobles, despite Alexander's efforts at accommodation, remained suspicious of Macedonian intentions. The hybrid culture Alexander was trying to create existed mainly at the elite level. Ordinary people in most regions continued to live much as they had before his arrival. Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BCE, at the age of just 32, left his empire without clear succession arrangements and his innovations incomplete. Within months, his generals, the Diadochi, were fighting each other for control of different parts of the empire. The unity Alexander had created through force of personality and military genius simply couldn't survive his absence. Yet the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from these succession wars preserved many of Alexander's innovations. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia all continued to blend Greek and local elements, support Greek learning and culture, and maintain the urban centers Alexander had founded. The Greek language became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. Greek architectural styles influenced building from Afghanistan to Algeria, and Greek philosophical schools established branches throughout the known world. Alexander's empire lasted only 13 years, but its impact on world history was immeasurable. He had proven that cultural synthesis could be as powerful as military conquest, that empires could be transformed rather than merely replaced, and that human ambition, properly directed, could reshape entire civilizations. The Hellenistic world he created would provide the foundation for both the Roman Empire and early Christianity, ensuring that his vision of cultural fusion would influence human development for millennia to come. Maurya Empire. While Alexander was carving his empire out of Persian territories in the west, a young man named Chandragupta was building something equally impressive in the east, an empire that would unite the Indian subcontinent for the first time in history and develop political innovations that influenced governance from Southeast Asia to Central Asia for over a millennium. The Maurya Empire represented not just military conquest but a sophisticated experiment in statecraft that combined practical administration with moral philosophy in ways that would set the standard for imperial governance throughout South and Southeast Asia. The story begins around 322 BCE, just 1 year after Alexander's death, when Chandragupta Maurya seized control of the kingdom of Magadha in the Ganges Valley. But unlike many ancient conquerors, Chandragupta didn't achieve power through noble birth or military genius alone. He had a secret weapon in the form of his advisor Chanakya, one of history's most brilliant political theorists and strategic thinkers. Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, wrote the Arthashastra, perhaps the most comprehensive manual of statecraft ever produced in the ancient world. This wasn't just a collection of political maxims, but a detailed blueprint for imperial administration that covered everything from military organization and economic policy to espionage networks and diplomatic strategy. The Arthashastra reads like a combination of Machiavelli's The Prince, a modern business school textbook, and a CIA operations manual, all written 2,000 years before any of these things existed. Under Chanakya's guidance, Chandragupta built an empire that was remarkable for its organizational sophistication. The Mauryan state was divided into provinces governed by appointed officials who reported through a complex bureaucratic hierarchy to the central government. But this wasn't the loose, decentralized system favored by many ancient empires. It was a comprehensive administrative apparatus that maintained detailed records, collected systematic taxation, and provided services to the population on a scale that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the modern era. The Mauryan military was equally impressive. Chandragupta maintained a standing army that ancient sources claim numbered over 600, 0 troops, including 30, 0 cavalry and 9, 0 war elephants. These numbers might be exaggerated, but they point to a military establishment that dwarfed anything in the contemporary Mediterranean world. The Mauryans had also learned from their brief encounters with Alexander's forces, adopting Greek siege techniques and developing new methods for integrating elephants, cavalry, and infantry in large-scale battles. But the empire's most distinctive feature was its approach to economic management. The Mauryan state operated extensive manufacturing enterprises, controlled key trade routes, and maintained monopolies over essential industries like salt production and mining. This wasn't simply extractive taxation. It was active economic management designed to maximize productivity and ensure stable revenues for imperial administration. The government built and maintained an extensive road network, including the famous Grand Trunk Road that connected the far corners of the empire, and established standardized weights and measures that facilitated trade across the subcontinent. The empire reached its zenith under Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, who ruled from roughly 268 to 232 BCE. Ashoka began his reign as a conventional conqueror, expanding Mauryan territory through a series of brutal military campaigns. The turning point came with his conquest of Kalinga, modern Odisha, around 261 BCE, a campaign so savage that it reportedly cost over 100 lives and displaced hundreds of thousands more. What happened next was unprecedented in ancient history. Ashoka experienced what he described as profound remorse for the suffering his conquests had caused. In a series of edicts carved on rocks and pillars throughout his empire, Ashoka renounced aggressive warfare and dedicated himself to governing according to Buddhist principles of non-violence, compassion, and moral duty. This wasn't just personal conversion, it was a fundamental transformation of imperial ideology that influenced governance throughout Asia for centuries. Ashoka's edicts, written in local languages across his empire, provide an extraordinary window into the mind of an ancient ruler grappling with the moral implications of power. He established hospitals for both humans and animals, planted medicinal gardens, built rest houses for travelers, and created a new class of officials called Dharma ministers, whose job was to ensure that government policies reflected moral principles rather than mere political expediency. This moral transformation didn't make Ashoka weak. If anything, it made his empire stronger. By positioning himself as a righteous ruler who governed for the benefit of his subjects rather than his own glory, Ashoka created a level of popular support that purely military empires couldn't achieve. His promotion of Buddhist values also provided a unifying ideology that helped bind together an empire spanning dozens of different ethnic and linguistic groups. Ashoka's rock and pillar edicts represent one of history's first systematic attempts at mass communication by a ruler. These monuments, scattered across an area larger than modern India, proclaimed imperial policies, moral teachings, and administrative announcements in local scripts and languages. They created a sense of shared identity and common purpose that transcended regional differences, making the Mauryan Empire feel like a genuine political community rather than just a collection of conquered territories. The empire's diplomatic reach was equally impressive. Ashoka maintained embassies with Hellenistic kingdoms in the west, sent Buddhist missionaries to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, and established trade relationships that stretched from Central Asia to Southeast Asia. The Mauryans were among the first to recognize that empires could expand their influence through cultural and religious means, as well as military conquest. But like all ancient empires, the Mauryan state contained within it the seeds of its own decline. The sophisticated administrative system that was the empire's greatest strength also made it expensive to maintain. The professional army, the extensive bureaucracy, the public works projects, and the moral programs all required enormous resources that strained even the productive Indian economy. More fundamentally, the empire faced the challenge that would ultimately destroy many ancient states: succession crises. After Ashoka's death in 232 BCE, the Mauryan dynasty quickly weakened as rival claimants fought for control and provincial governors declared independence. The sophisticated administrative system that had held the empire together under strong rulers became a liability when central authority weakened. The final Mauryan emperor, Brihadratha, was overthrown in a military coup led by his general Pushyamitra Shunga around 185 BCE. The empire fragmented into smaller kingdoms, and India wouldn't be united again for centuries. But the Mauryan legacy lived on in the administrative traditions they had established, the cultural synthesis they had promoted, and the political ideologies they had developed. Ashoka's transformation from conqueror to moral ruler became a model for legitimate kingship throughout South and Southeast Asia. His promotion of Buddhism helped establish it as a major world religion, and his edicts provided a template for royal proclamations that influenced rulers from Afghanistan to Indonesia. The Mauryan Empire had proven that empires could be held together by shared values and moral authority as effectively as by military force, and that successful rulers needed to be philosophers and administrators as well as warriors. Han Dynasty Empire. In 206 BCE, while the Mauryan Empire was reaching its moral pinnacle under Ashoka, a peasant-born rebel named Liu Bang was putting the finishing touches on his conquest of China, founding a dynasty that would last over 400 years and create the template for Chinese imperial government that would persist, with modifications, until 1912. The Han Dynasty wasn't just another ancient empire. It was a civilization-defining experiment in meritocratic governance, systematic administration, and cultural synthesis that would make Han synonymous with Chinese for millennia to come. Liu Bang's rise to power came through the chaos that followed the collapse of the Qin dynasty, China's first unified empire. The Qin had achieved unification through brutal military conquest and harsh legalist policies, but their empire collapsed within 15 years due to popular rebellions and succession disputes. Liu Bang, who had started the civil war as a minor local official, defeated his rivals through a combination of military skill, political acumen, and an intuitive understanding of what the Chinese people wanted after decades of warfare and oppression. What they wanted, it turned out, was stability, prosperity, and fair government, and the Han dynasty would spend the next 4 centuries perfecting systems to deliver exactly that. The Han synthesis combined Confucian moral philosophy with legalist administrative practices and Taoist principles of governance, creating a political philosophy that emphasized both effective administration and ethical leadership. This wasn't just pragmatic compromise. It was a sophisticated attempt to create a form of government that could maintain order while respecting human dignity. The cornerstone of Han governance was the development of a professional civil service, selected through competitive examinations. This system, which began modestly under the early Han and reached full development during later dynasties, represented a revolutionary approach to staffing government positions. Instead of relying on noble birth, military service, or personal connections, the Han began selecting officials based on their knowledge of Confucian classics, their ability to write essays on political and moral topics, and their demonstrated competence in administrative tasks. This meritocratic system had profound implications for Chinese society. It meant that any man, regardless of social background, could theoretically rise to the highest positions in government through study and talent. It created a scholarly class that was deeply invested in the stability and success of the imperial system, and it established education as the primary path to social mobility, making China perhaps history's first true education society, where learning was valued above birth or wealth. The Han also pioneered systematic economic management on a scale that wouldn't be matched anywhere else for centuries. They conducted regular censuses that counted not just population but livestock, agricultural output, and manufactured goods. The government maintained detailed records of tax collection, trade flows, and regional economic conditions that allowed for sophisticated economic planning and crisis management. When famines struck one region, the state could redistribute grain from areas with surplus. When floods damaged infrastructure, the government could mobilize resources for reconstruction on a massive scale. The opening of the Silk Road under Emperor Wu, 140–187 BCE, represented perhaps the Han dynasty's greatest achievement in international relations. This wasn't just a trade route, it was a comprehensive system of diplomatic, military, and commercial relationships that connected China with Central Asia, India, Persia, and ultimately the Roman Empire. Chinese silk, porcelain, and technology flowed west while horses, precious stones, and new crops flowed east, creating the world's first truly global economy. But the Silk Road also served crucial military and diplomatic purposes. The Han used trade relationships to build alliances with nomadic tribes, established military colonies in the western regions to protect merchant caravans, and developed intelligence networks that kept them informed about developments across Central Asia. When the nomadic Xiongnu Confederation threatened Chinese borders, the Han could use their Silk Road connections to form coalitions, secure horses for their cavalry, and even arranged for attacks on Xiongnu rear areas by allied tribes. The Han military itself represented a sophisticated synthesis of Chinese and foreign military traditions. The dynasty inherited the Qin's organizational innovations, standardized weapons, professional officer corps, detailed logistics systems, but added new elements learned from contact with nomadic peoples. Han armies featured large cavalry units equipped with new stirrup technology, crossbow battalions that could fire synchronized volleys, and siege engines that incorporated both Chinese engineering and foreign innovations. The dynasty's approach to frontier management was equally sophisticated. Instead of building a single Great Wall, the Han developed a comprehensive frontier defense system that included multiple wall networks, beacon towers for communication, military colonies for local defense, and diplomatic relationships with tributary tribes. This system was flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining security across thousands of miles of contested borderland. Under Emperor Wu, the Han expanded their territory to include modern Vietnam in the south, much of Central Asia in the west, and parts of Korea in the northeast. But this expansion came at enormous cost. The constant military campaigns, infrastructure projects, and administrative overhead strained even China's productive economy. By the end of Wu's reign, the dynasty was facing serious financial difficulties that would plague it for generations. The Han response to these challenges revealed both their administrative sophistication and their systemic vulnerabilities. They experimented with state monopolies on salt and iron production to increase revenues, developed new tax collection methods, and even tried issuing paper money backed by government reserves. But they also increasingly relied on wealthy merchants and landowners to fund government operations, creating powerful private interests that could challenge imperial authority. The dynasty's middle period saw a remarkable cultural flowering that established patterns for Chinese civilization that would persist for millennia. Han scholars compiled the Confucian classics into their canonical form, established the historical writing traditions that would define Chinese historiography, and developed the artistic styles that became synonymous with classical Chinese culture. The dynasty's official histories, particularly Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, set standards for objective historical writing that influenced scholarship throughout East Asia. But perhaps most importantly, the Han developed a conception of Chinese identity that transcended regional and ethnic differences. Through their administrative systems, cultural policies, and educational programs, they created a sense of shared kineseness that could unite people across vast geographical and social divides. This wasn't just political propaganda. It was a genuine cultural synthesis that made the diverse populations of the empire feel they belonged to a common civilization. The dynasty's later centuries were marked by increasing tensions between central authority and local power. As the imperial government struggled with financial difficulties, wealthy families accumulated land and influence that allowed them to challenge state authority. Regional governors began acting more like independent rulers, and the professional military gradually gave way to armies loyal to individual commanders rather than the imperial system. The final crisis came through a combination of natural disasters, economic collapse, and political fragmentation. Climate change in the 12th century CE brought severe droughts and floods that disrupted agriculture and forced massive population movements. The government's financial difficulties made it impossible to provide effective disaster relief, leading to widespread rebellions. The Yellow Turban Revolt of 184 CE involved hundreds of thousands of peasants and required years of military campaigns to suppress. Even more dangerous were the conflicts between court factions, particularly the struggle between eunuch advisors and the families of imperial consorts. These groups fought for control of weak emperors, using their influence to advance their own interests at the expense of effective governance. The imperial system that had been designed to prevent exactly these kinds of factional conflicts proved unable to reform itself when the stakes became too high. The Han dynasty formally ended in 220 CE when the last emperor abdicated in favor of a military strongman, but effective central control had been lost decades earlier. China fragmented into competing kingdoms, beginning a period of division that would last nearly 4 centuries. Yet the Han legacy proved remarkably durable. Later Chinese dynasties consistently looked back to Han models of governance, and the Chinese people continued to call themselves Han long after the dynasty had disappeared. The Han Empire had proven that meritocratic governance could create stability and prosperity on a continental scale, that cultural unity could be as important as military force in holding empires together, and that systematic administration could enable societies to weather crises that would destroy less organized states. Their innovations in civil service, economic management, and frontier policy would influence not just China, but the entire East Asian world for over a millennium. Roman Empire. By 27 BCE, when Augustus became the first Roman emperor, the Mediterranean world had witnessed the rise and fall of numerous great empires, Persian, Athenian, Macedonian, and others, each contributing innovations to the art of imperial governance. But none of them had managed to create a truly durable system that could maintain unity and prosperity across multiple continents for centuries. Rome was about to change that, developing the most successful and long-lasting empire in Western history through a combination of military excellence, legal innovation, administrative flexibility, and cultural synthesis that modern states still study and emulate. The Roman Empire didn't emerge overnight. It was the culmination of nearly 5 centuries of republican expansion that had gradually brought the entire Mediterranean basin under Roman control. But the transformation from republic to empire under Augustus represented more than just a change in leadership. It was a fundamental reimagining of how vast, diverse territories could be governed effectively and permanently. Augustus's genius lay in his ability to preserve the forms of republican government while creating entirely new structures of imperial administration. He maintained the Senate, the consuls, and the traditional magistracies, but he also created new positions, prefects, legates, and procurators, that answered directly to him and controlled the empire's military, financial, and administrative apparatus. This allowed him to satisfy Roman traditionalists who valued republican institutions while building the centralized authority necessary to govern an empire spanning 3 continents. The foundation of Roman imperial success was military excellence refined over centuries of constant warfare. The Roman legions weren't just effective fighting forces, they were sophisticated organizations that combined combat capability with engineering expertise, administrative skills, and cultural adaptability. Roman soldiers built roads, aqueducts, and fortifications. They served as police, tax collectors, and judges. They spread Roman law, language, and customs throughout the empire, while also learning from local populations. But the real innovation was in how Rome treated conquered peoples. Unlike earlier empires that maintained sharp distinctions between rulers and subjects, Rome developed a graduated system of citizenship that could eventually incorporate almost anyone into the Roman community. Local elites could earn Roman citizenship through military service or civic contributions. Entire communities could be granted various levels of Roman status, and over time, the distinction between Romans and provincials became increasingly meaningless. This inclusive approach created a level of popular support that purely coercive empires couldn't achieve. When local populations felt they could benefit from Roman rule through economic opportunities, legal protections, or social advancement, they became stakeholders in the imperial system rather than reluctant subjects. The result was an empire that could largely govern itself through the voluntary cooperation of millions of people who had come to see themselves as Roman. The legal system that made this possible was perhaps Rome's greatest contribution to human civilization. Roman law wasn't just a collection of rules. It was a comprehensive philosophy of justice that could be adapted to different circumstances while maintaining consistent principles. The development of the Corpus Juris Civilis under Justinian in the 6th century CE codified centuries of legal evolution, creating a systematic body of law that would influence legal systems worldwide for over a millennium. Roman engineering and architecture served both practical and symbolic purposes. The roads that connected every corner of the empire weren't just transportation infrastructure, they were symbols of Roman power and permanence, physical manifestations of the imperial claim that all roads led to Rome. The aqueducts that supplied fresh water to major cities demonstrated Roman technical capability, while improving living conditions for millions of people. The amphitheaters, baths, and temples that dotted the imperial landscape proclaimed Roman cultural superiority while providing genuine benefits to local populations. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, that characterized the first 2 centuries of imperial rule represented an unprecedented achievement in human history. For the first time, the entire Mediterranean world enjoyed relative peace, security, and prosperity under a single governmental system. Trade flowed freely from Britain to the Persian Gulf, cultural exchange flourished from Spain to Syria, and millions of people lived their entire lives without experiencing the warfare that had characterized earlier periods. This peace was maintained through a sophisticated combination of military deterrence, diplomatic skill, and economic integration. The Roman army, stationed primarily on the frontiers, served as both a protective shield and a visible reminder of imperial power. Roman diplomacy managed relationships with neighboring kingdoms and barbarian tribes through treaties, subsidies, and carefully managed competitions for Roman favor. The Roman economic system integrated local economies into empire-wide networks of production and exchange that made rebellion economically destructive as well as militarily dangerous. The cultural dimension of Roman imperialism was equally important. Rome didn't impose a uniform culture on its subjects. Instead, it created space for a remarkable synthesis of local traditions with Roman innovations. Greek philosophy combined with Roman legal thinking, Egyptian religious practices merged with Roman civic traditions, Celtic art styles influenced Roman decorative motifs. This cultural flexibility allowed the empire to feel familiar and comfortable to diverse populations while gradually spreading Roman values and practices. The empire's urban civilization reached levels of sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe again until the modern era. Cities like Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Carthage became centers of learning, commerce, and artistic achievement that attracted people from across the known world. Roman cities featured public libraries, hospitals, fire departments, and police forces. They maintained detailed records of births, deaths, and property ownership. They provided entertainment, education, and social services that made urban life attractive to millions of people. But the Roman system also contained inherent contradictions and vulnerabilities that would ultimately prove fatal. The empire's success created wealth and luxury that gradually undermined the military virtues that had built Roman power. The integration of barbarian peoples into Roman society provided manpower and cultural vitality, but also introduced groups with different loyalties and traditions. The growth of Christianity offered spiritual meaning to millions of people, but challenged traditional Roman religious and political assumptions. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 CE, revealed how fragile the imperial system had become. Economic inflation, military rebellions, barbarian invasions, and plague combined to create a perfect storm that nearly destroyed the empire entirely. Over 50 years, more than 20 emperors claimed power, most dying violent deaths. Entire provinces were lost to barbarian invaders, and the monetary system collapsed so completely that many regions reverted to barter economies. Diocletian's reforms, 284–305 CE, provided temporary stability through administrative reorganization, economic controls, and religious persecution, but they also transformed the empire into something very different from what Augustus had created. The tetrarchy system divided imperial authority among multiple rulers. The expanded bureaucracy created new layers of administration. The fixed prices and occupational restrictions turned the economy into a controlled system that stifled innovation and growth. Constantine's conversion to Christianity and the founding of Constantinople represented another fundamental transformation. The empire that had been built on traditional Roman values and civic religion was now officially Christian, with a new capital that looked east toward Asia rather than west toward the traditional Roman heartland. This wasn't just political change, it was cultural revolution that redefined what it meant to be Roman. The division of the empire into western and eastern halves under Theodosius I in 395 CE acknowledged what had become increasingly obvious. The Roman world had grown too large and complex to be governed from a single center. The Western Roman Empire, facing constant barbarian pressure and internal decay, finally collapsed in 476 CE when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last emperor. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, would continue for another 1,000 years, gradually evolving into something quite different from its classical predecessor. Yet Rome's legacy proved more durable than any of its political successors. Roman law influenced legal systems throughout Europe and beyond. Latin became the language of scholarship, diplomacy, and religion for over a millennium. Roman architectural and engineering techniques shaped building practices worldwide, and the ideal of universal empire under law continued to inspire political thinkers from Charlemagne to Napoleon to the founders of the European Union. The Roman Empire had proven that diverse peoples could be united under just laws, that military power could be combined with cultural achievement, and that empires could endure for centuries if they remained flexible enough to adapt while maintaining their core principles. It was the most successful experiment in imperial governance the world had ever seen, and its influence on subsequent history was immeasurable. Gupta Golden Age. While the Western Roman Empire was struggling through its final centuries of decline, halfway around the world in northern India, another empire was entering what historians would later call a Golden Age, a period of such remarkable cultural, scientific, and artistic achievement that it would influence human civilization for millennia. The Gupta Empire, ruling from roughly 320 to 550 CE, proved that empires could be measured not just by their territorial extent or military power, but by their contributions to human knowledge, artistic beauty, and intellectual progress. The Gupta rise began modestly around 320 CE when Chandragupta I, not to be confused with the earlier Mauryan founder, established control over the Ganges Valley through a combination of military conquest and strategic marriage alliances. But it was under his successors, particularly Chandragupta II, who ruled from 375 to 415 CE, that the empire reached its zenith and earned its reputation as one of history's most culturally accomplished civilizations. What made the Gupta period so remarkable wasn't the size of their territory. The empire was considerably smaller than its Mauryan predecessor, but the extraordinary flowering of intellectual and artistic achievement that occurred under their patronage. This was an empire that measured its success not in conquered provinces but in mathematical innovations, literary masterpieces, and architectural marvels that pushed the boundaries of human creativity and understanding. The Gupta contribution to mathematics alone would justify their place in history. It was during this period that Indian mathematicians developed the decimal system, including the revolutionary concept of zero as both a placeholder and a number in its own right. This might seem like a technical detail, but it was actually one of the most important intellectual breakthroughs in human history, the foundation for all advanced mathematics and, by extension, for modern science and technology. Aryabhata, who lived from 476 to 550 CE, exemplified Gupta mathematical genius. He calculated the value of pi to 4 decimal places, developed techniques for solving quadratic equations, and proposed that the Earth rotated on its axis, a theory that wouldn't be accepted in Europe for another 1,000 years. His work on astronomy included accurate calculations of eclipses and planetary movements that demonstrated the sophisticated mathematical tools available to Gupta scholars. The period's literary achievements were equally impressive. This was the era when Kalidasa, often called the Shakespeare of Sanskrit, created his masterworks including The Cloud Messenger and Shakuntala, poems and plays that combined emotional depth with technical virtuosity in ways that influenced literary traditions throughout Asia. The Gupta court attracted scholars, poets, and artists from across the known world, creating a cosmopolitan intellectual environment that fostered innovation and cross-cultural exchange. But perhaps most remarkably, the Gupta Empire achieved these cultural heights while maintaining a remarkably decentralized and flexible system of governance. Unlike the highly centralized bureaucracies of Rome or Han China, the Guptas ruled through a feudal system that granted considerable autonomy to local rulers in exchange for tribute and military service. This approach allowed for significant regional variation in customs, languages, and administrative practices while maintaining overall imperial unity. This decentralization extended to religious policy as well. While the Gupta rulers were generally Hindu and patronized Hindu temples and scholars, they also supported Buddhist institutions and allowed various religious traditions to flourish throughout their territory. The famous Ajanta caves, with their extraordinary Buddhist paintings and sculptures, were created during the Gupta period with imperial support, demonstrating the dynasty's commitment to religious pluralism and artistic patronage. The Gupta economic system was equally sophisticated, based on a combination of agricultural productivity, thriving trade networks, and skilled craftsmanship. Indian textiles, spices, and manufactured goods were highly prized throughout Asia and even reached markets in the Roman Empire. The Guptas maintained trade relationships that stretched from Southeast Asia to Central Asia, making India a crucial hub in the emerging global economy of late antiquity. The empire's urban centers, particularly the capital at Pataliputra, modern Patna, became renowned throughout the ancient world for their wealth, sophistication, and learning. The Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Faxian, who visited India during Chandragupta II's reign, described cities with well-planned streets, magnificent palaces, and charitable institutions that provided free medical care to the poor. His accounts suggest a level of urban civilization that rivaled anything in contemporary Rome or Constantinople. Gupta art and architecture established aesthetic standards that would influence Indian culture for centuries. The period saw the development of the classical Indian temple form, with its characteristic tower, shikara, and elaborate sculptural decoration. Gupta sculptures achieved a level of technical perfection and spiritual expressiveness that historians consider the pinnacle of Indian artistic achievement. The famous standing Buddha from Sarnath, with its serene expression and flowing robes, exemplifies the Gupta artistic synthesis of realistic technique with transcendent spirituality. The empire's scientific achievements extended well beyond mathematics and astronomy. Gupta physicians made important advances in medicine, including early forms of cataract surgery and sophisticated understanding of disease transmission. Their metallurgists created the famous Iron Pillar of Delhi, a 23-foot-tall monument that has resisted corrosion for over 500 years, demonstrating technical skills that modern engineers struggle to replicate. But the Gupta Empire's most lasting contribution may have been its role in preserving and systematizing ancient Indian knowledge. Gupta scholars compiled the classic texts of Hindu philosophy, codified grammatical rules for Sanskrit, and created comprehensive treatises on subjects ranging from astronomy to architecture. This scholarly activity ensured that the intellectual achievements of earlier periods would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The empire's decline began in the late 5th century CE through a combination of external pressure and internal weaknesses. The invasion of the Hunna, White Huns, from Central Asia disrupted trade routes and forced the empire to spend enormous resources on military defense. At the same time, the decentralized system that had been the empire's strength during peacetime became a liability during crisis, as local rulers increasingly acted independently of central authority. The final blow came through the gradual breakdown of the economic networks that had sustained Gupta prosperity. Climate change and political instability disrupted trade routes, reducing the tribute and customs revenues that funded imperial administration. Without the wealth to maintain their armies and bureaucracy, the Guptas could no longer control their far-flung territories. By 550 CE, the Gupta Empire had fragmented into numerous smaller kingdoms, ending what historians consider the last great native Indian empire until the rise of the Mughals nearly 1,000 years later. But the cultural and intellectual achievements of the Gupta period proved far more durable than their political power. The mathematical innovations pioneered under the Guptas spread throughout the Islamic world and eventually reached Europe, where they became the foundation for the scientific revolution. The artistic styles developed during this period continued to influence Indian art and architecture for centuries. The literary works created by Gupta poets remained central to Indian cultural identity throughout subsequent periods of foreign rule. Most importantly, The Gupta Empire demonstrated that political power could be used to foster human creativity and intellectual achievement, rather than simply to extract wealth or project military force. They showed that empires could be measured by their contributions to human knowledge and artistic beauty, as well as by their territorial extent or administrative efficiency. In an age when most empires were focused on conquest and control, the Guptas proved that the greatest imperial legacy might be the ideas, art, and innovations that outlast any political system. Byzantine Empire. In 330 CE, when Constantine the Great founded his New Rome on the shores of the Bosphorus, he probably didn't imagine that his new city would outlast the original Rome by nearly 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire, though its inhabitants always called themselves Romans, would become one of history's most remarkable experiments in cultural synthesis, religious transformation, and imperial adaptation, surviving barbarian invasions, Islamic conquests, crusader attacks, and plague outbreaks that destroyed countless other civilizations. The story of Byzantium is really the story of how the eastern half of the Roman Empire reinvented itself to survive in a completely changed world. While the western provinces collapsed under barbarian pressure in the 5th century, the eastern territories, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, developed new forms of government, military organization, and cultural identity that allowed them to persist for another millennium. The transformation began under Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE and represented the last emperor to seriously attempt restoring the full territorial extent of the old Roman Empire. Justinian's reign was marked by ambitious military campaigns that reconquered much of Italy, North Africa, and southern Spain, but his most lasting achievements were in law, architecture, and administrative reform. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Justinian's direction, represented the culmination of nearly 1,000 years of Roman legal development. This wasn't just a collection of laws, but a comprehensive legal philosophy that would influence jurisprudence throughout Europe for centuries. The code provided the foundation for legal systems from medieval kingdoms to modern nation-states, making Justinian's legal scholars among the most influential thinkers in human history. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 537 CE, was even more revolutionary in its impact. This massive domed cathedral pushed the boundaries of architectural possibility, creating an interior space that seemed to defy gravity and earthly limitations. For nearly 1,000 years, it remained the largest enclosed space in the world, and its architectural innovations influenced building design from Russia to the Ottoman Empire. But Justinian's military campaigns, magnificent buildings, and legal compilations came at enormous cost. The constant warfare drained the imperial treasury, while the expense of grand construction projects and expanded bureaucracy strained the economy beyond its limits. The empire that Justinian left to his successors was exhausted, financially depleted, and vulnerable to new threats that were already gathering on the horizons. Those threats materialized in the 7th century with the rise of Islam. The new Arab armies, unified by religious enthusiasm and superior military tactics, conquered Syria, Egypt, and North Africa in a series of lightning campaigns that reduced the Byzantine Empire to a fraction of its former size. The loss of Egypt was particularly devastating. It had been the empire's breadbasket and major source of tax revenue for centuries. The Byzantine response to this crisis was remarkable and would define the empire's character for the next several centuries. Instead of trying to maintain the old Roman system of professional armies and centralized administration, the Byzantines developed the theme system, a revolutionary approach to military organization and provincial government that combined civilian and military authority in the hands of provincial commanders called strategoi. Under the theme system, soldiers were granted land in exchange for military service, creating a class of farmer soldiers who had strong incentives to defend their territories against invasion. This system was much less expensive than maintaining professional armies, and it created a more resilient defense structure that could continue fighting even when central authority was disrupted. The themes became largely self-governing military districts that could coordinate with Constantinople when possible, but operate independently when necessary. The theme system also facilitated one of the most successful military innovations of the medieval period, Greek fire. This incendiary weapon, whose exact composition remains unknown, gave Byzantine naval forces a crucial advantage in their struggles against Arab fleets. Greek fire could burn on water, making it devastatingly effective in naval battles, and its psychological impact was enormous. Enemies who had never encountered such weapons often fled in panic. But the most distinctive aspect of Byzantine civilization was its unique synthesis of Greek classical learning, Roman governmental traditions, and Christian religious culture. Unlike Western Europe, where classical knowledge was largely lost during the early medieval period, Byzantium maintained unbroken connections to ancient Greek philosophy, literature, and science. Byzantine scholars preserved and copied classical texts, maintained schools that taught ancient languages, and continued philosophical and theological traditions that stretched back to Plato and Aristotle. This intellectual continuity made Constantinople one of the world's great centers of learning throughout the medieval period. The imperial library contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, including works that survived nowhere else in the world. Byzantine universities maintained traditions of mathematical and scientific learning that had disappeared from Western Europe, and Byzantine theologians developed sophisticated philosophical systems that influenced both Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Islamic thought. The empire's religious character was equally distinctive. While Western Christianity was developing the papal system and feudal structures, Eastern Orthodox Christianity evolved very different institutional forms. The Byzantine emperor was considered God's representative on earth, but the church maintained considerable independence from imperial control. The Patriarch of Constantinople held authority over Eastern Orthodox churches throughout the empire and beyond, but he was theoretically equal to other patriarchs rather than supreme over them. This religious system created both strengths and vulnerabilities for the empire. On one hand, Orthodox Christianity provided a unifying ideology that helped hold together an empire spanning numerous ethnic and linguistic groups. Orthodox missionaries spread Byzantine influence throughout the Balkans, Russia, and parts of the Caucasus, creating cultural connections that outlasted political control. On the other hand, religious controversies, particularly the iconoclastic period from 726 to 843 CE, sometimes caused serious internal divisions and weakened imperial authority. The 11th century marked both the height and the beginning of the end for Byzantine power. Under the Macedonian dynasty, the empire experienced a remarkable revival that saw territorial expansion, economic prosperity, and cultural flowering. Constantinople became one of the world's largest and wealthiest cities, with a population that may have reached 400 people. Byzantine armies reconquered much of Anatolia and pushed into Syria and the Balkans. But this revival also brought new challenges. The empire's renewed wealth and power attracted the attention of new enemies: Norman adventurers in southern Italy, Turkish tribes migrating from Central Asia, and eventually Western European crusaders who supposedly came as allies but often acted as conquerors. The disaster at Manzikert in 1071, where Emperor Romanos IV was captured by the Seljuk Turks, marked the beginning of the end for Byzantine control over Anatolia. The Crusades presented the Byzantines with an almost impossible dilemma. They needed Western military help to reconquer their lost territories, but the Crusaders' goals and methods often conflicted with Byzantine interests. The First Crusade succeeded in establishing Crusader states in the Levant, but these new kingdoms often competed with Byzantium rather than supporting it. Subsequent crusades became increasingly problematic for the Byzantines, culminating in the catastrophe of 1204. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 was perhaps the most destructive event in Byzantine history. The Crusaders, originally intended to attack Egypt, were diverted to Constantinople through a complex series of political and financial machinations. They captured and looted the city, destroying countless works of art and literature, massacring thousands of civilians, and establishing the Latin Empire of Constantinople that would last for 57 years. The restoration of Byzantine rule in 1261 under Michael VIII, Palaiologos represented remarkable resilience, but the empire that emerged was a shadow of its former self. The Paleologus dynasty ruled over territories that were often limited to Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, plus scattered holdings in Greece and Anatolia. The empire had become a minor regional power, struggling to survive between the expanding Ottoman Empire and various Western European states. Yet, even in decline, Byzantium continued to make important contributions to human civilization. Byzantine scholars played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting classical Greek texts to Western Europe, helping to fuel the Renaissance. The empire's diplomatic traditions influenced international relations throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, and Orthodox Christianity, shaped by centuries of Byzantine development, became the dominant religion throughout much of Eastern Europe and Russia. The final siege of Constantinople in 1453 represented the end of more than 1,000 years of continuous Roman imperial tradition. Sultan Mehmed II's conquest of the city marked not just the fall of the Byzantine Empire, but the end of an era in world history. Yet the Byzantine legacy lived on in the Orthodox churches of Eastern Europe, in the legal and administrative traditions they had preserved, and in the classical learning they had maintained through the darkest periods of medieval history. The Byzantine Empire had proven that civilizations could adapt, transform, and survive for extraordinary periods of time if they remained flexible enough to change while maintaining continuity with their deepest traditions. They showed that empires could be measured not just by their military power or territorial extent, but by their ability to preserve and transmit human knowledge, culture, and spiritual insight across centuries of challenge and change. Umayyad Caliphate. In the blazing heat of the Arabian Peninsula in 632 CE, as the Prophet Muhammad died in Medina, few could have imagined that within a century his followers would rule an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the banks of the Indus River in India. The Umayyad Caliphate, which dominated this vast territory from 661 to 750 CE, represented one of the most rapid and successful imperial expansions in human history, creating a new form of empire based on religious ideology, Arab tribal organization, and remarkable cultural synthesis. The Umayyad rise to power came through the first great crisis in Islamic history, the civil wars that followed the assassination of Caliph Uthman in 656 CE. These conflicts, known as the First Fitna, pitted different factions of early Muslims against each other over questions of leadership, religious authority, and the direction of the expanding Islamic community. When Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan emerged victorious in 661 CE, he established not just a new dynasty, but a new model for Islamic government that would shape the Muslim world for centuries. The Umayyads faced an extraordinary challenge: how to govern an empire that spanned 3 continents, included dozens of different ethnic and linguistic groups, and encompassed territories that had previously belonged to the Byzantine and Persian empires. Their solution was revolutionary. They created the first truly global empire in human history, one that combined Arab tribal traditions with sophisticated administrative techniques borrowed from their conquered territories. The speed of Islamic expansion under the Umayyads was breathtaking. Within 90 years of Muhammad's death, Muslim armies had conquered the entire Sassanid Persian Empire, captured most of the Byzantine Empire's richest provinces, overrun Visigothic Spain, and pushed into France until they were finally stopped at the Battle of Tours in 732 CE. This represented territorial expansion on a scale and speed that dwarfed even Alexander's conquests, creating an empire larger than Rome at its greatest extent. But what made this expansion truly remarkable wasn't just its speed, it was the relatively peaceful nature of the conquests and the sophisticated administrative systems the Umayyads developed to govern their new territories. Unlike many previous conquerors who ruled through force and terror, the early Muslim armies often found local populations welcoming them as liberators from oppressive Byzantine or Persian rule. The key to Umayyad's success was their development of a flexible system of governance that could accommodate the diverse needs of their vast empire while maintaining Islamic unity. At the center was the Caliph, who served as both political leader and religious authority for the worldwide Muslim community. But actual administration was carried out through a complex hierarchy of governors, tax collectors, and judges who often retained local officials and adapted Islamic law to local conditions. The Umayyads were particularly innovative in their approach to religious and cultural diversity. While they established Islam as the dominant religion and Arabic as the language of government, they generally allowed Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian communities to maintain their religious practices in exchange for paying a special tax called the jizya. This system of dhimmi, protected people, status created a relatively tolerant, multi-religious society that contrasted sharply with the religious persecution common in contemporary Christian empires. The economic foundations of the Umayyad Empire were equally sophisticated. They inherited and improved upon the trade networks of the Byzantine and Persian empires, but they also created new commercial connections that linked previously separate economic zones. Muslim merchants established trading posts from Spain to India, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies on an unprecedented scale. The Umayyads were also great builders and patrons of architecture. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, completed in 691 CE, was more than just a magnificent building. It was a statement of Islamic political and religious authority in one of the world's most contested sacred spaces. Its architectural synthesis of Byzantine, Persian, and Arab elements exemplified the Umayyad approach to cultural integration. Damascus, the Umayyad capital, became one of the world's great cities under their rule. The Great Mosque of Damascus, built on the site of a Christian cathedral, demonstrated the dynasty's ability to create magnificent Islamic architecture while respecting the sacred associations of conquered territories. The city attracted scholars, artists, and merchants from across the known world, becoming a center of learning and culture that rivaled Constantinople and Baghdad. The Umayyad postal system was another crucial innovation. Building on Persian and Byzantine precedents, they created a comprehensive communication network that allowed messages to travel from Spain to Central Asia in a matter of weeks. This system, known as the Barid, was essential for governing such a vast empire and also facilitated trade and cultural exchange throughout the Islamic world. But perhaps the Umayyads' most important contribution was their role in establishing Arabic as a truly international language. While the Quran had been revealed in Arabic, it was the Umayyad administrative system that made Arabic the language of government, commerce, and learning throughout their empire. This linguistic unification had profound cultural implications, creating a shared intellectual space that enabled scholars from Morocco to Afghanistan to communicate and collaborate. The dynasty also oversaw the first systematic compilation of Islamic law and the beginning of Islamic historical writing. Umayyad scholars developed the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence, created the earliest biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, and established traditions of Arabic poetry and literature that would influence Islamic culture for centuries. However, the Umayyad Empire also contained serious internal contradictions that would ultimately prove fatal. The dynasty was identified with Arab tribal aristocracy, particularly Syrian tribes that had been among their earliest supporters. This created resentment among non-Arab Muslims who felt they were treated as second-class citizens despite their conversion to Islam. The Persian and other non-Arab populations, in particular, increasingly resented Arab domination. Religious tensions also weakened the dynasty. The Umayyads were often accused of being too worldly and insufficiently pious, more concerned with political power than spiritual leadership. Various opposition groups, Shiites who supported the family of Ali, Kharijites who demanded strict Islamic purity, and Abbasids who claimed descent from the Prophet's family, all challenged Umayyad legitimacy on religious grounds. The economic system that had fueled Umayyad expansion also created new problems. The empire's wealth was based largely on conquest and tribute, which meant that revenue declined when expansion stopped. The costs of maintaining armies and administering vast territories began to exceed the income from taxation and booty, creating financial strains that weakened central authority. The final crisis came through a combination of military defeats, internal rebellions, and succession disputes. The Umayyad army suffered significant losses in campaigns against the Byzantines and in Central Asia. Simultaneously, the Abbasid revolution, which began in eastern Iran in 747 CE, gained support throughout the empire by promising a more egalitarian and religiously authentic form of Islamic government. The decisive battle at the Zab River in 750 CE ended Umayyad rule in the east, though one prince, Abd al-Rahman I, escaped to Spain and established an independent Umayyad emirate that would last for another 3 centuries. But the main dynasty was destroyed so thoroughly that the Abbasids systematically murdered almost every member of the Umayyad family they could find. Despite their relatively brief rule, the Umayyads had fundamentally transformed the ancient world. They had proven that empires could be based on religious ideology rather than ethnic identity or territorial control. They had demonstrated that rapid territorial expansion could be combined with sophisticated administration and cultural tolerance. Most importantly, they had established Islam as a world religion and Arabic as an international language, creating the foundations for Islamic civilization that would flourish for centuries under their successors. The Umayyad legacy lived on in the administrative systems they had created, the architectural monuments they had built, and the cultural synthesis they had fostered. Their model of empire, combining religious authority with political power, Arab identity with universal mission, and rapid expansion with administrative sophistication, would influence Islamic political thought for centuries and provide inspiration for future Muslim rulers from the Abbasids to the Ottomans. Abbasid Caliphate. When the Abbasid revolutionaries finally defeated the last Umayyad armies at the Battle of the Zab in 750 CE, they inherited an empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia, but faced a crucial question. How do you govern a territory larger than Rome ever controlled while remaining true to Islamic principles of justice, equality, and piety? The answer they developed over the next 5 centuries would create what many historians consider the greatest flowering of Islamic civilization, transforming Baghdad into the intellectual capital of the world and establishing patterns of Islamic governance, scholarship, and culture that would influence human development for millennia. The Abbasid revolution wasn't just a dynastic change, it was a fundamental transformation of Islamic imperial ideology. Where the Umayyads had been identified with Arab tribal aristocracy and Syrian military power, the Abbasids positioned themselves as representatives of all Muslims regardless of ethnic background. Their revolution had been supported by Persian, Arab, and other groups who felt marginalized under Umayyad rule, and their victory represented a triumph of Islamic universalism over Arab particularism. The new dynasty's most visible symbol of this transformation was their decision to build an entirely new capital at Baghdad in 762 CE. The site was chosen with typical Abbasid sophistication, located at the intersection of major trade routes, positioned to control river traffic between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean, and placed in a region with sufficient agricultural productivity to support a massive urban population. But Baghdad was more than just a strategically located city. It was a statement about the kind of empire the Abbasids intended to create. The round city of Baghdad, as originally conceived by the second Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, was a marvel of urban planning that reflected both practical considerations and symbolic meanings. The circular design, with the Caliph's palace and the main mosque at the center, represented the idea that all Islamic territories were equidistant from the central authority. The city was designed to house scholars, craftsmen, merchants, and administrators from throughout the Islamic world, creating a truly cosmopolitan capital that embodied Abbasid ideals of universal Islamic community. Within a century, Baghdad had grown into one of the world's largest cities, with a population that may have reached over 1 million people. The city became famous throughout the known world for its wealth, learning, and cultural sophistication. The markets of Baghdad sold goods from China to Spain. Its libraries contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Its scholars made advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The intellectual achievements of Abbasid Baghdad were particularly remarkable. The famous House of Wisdom, established during the reign of Harun al-Rashid, 786–809 CE, and expanded under his son al-Ma'mun, became the greatest center of learning in the medieval world. This institution combined library, research center, translation bureau, and academy, bringing together scholars from different religious and ethnic backgrounds to work on projects that advanced human knowledge across multiple fields. The translation movement sponsored by the early Abbasids was one of the most important intellectual projects in human history. Teams of scholars, many of them Christians and Jews as well as Muslims, systematically translated Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and other texts into Arabic, preserving works that might otherwise have been lost forever. The writings of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, and other classical authors were not just translated but extensively commented upon, creating new syntheses of ancient wisdom and Islamic thought. But the Abbasids didn't just preserve ancient knowledge, they created new knowledge on an unprecedented scale. Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra and made crucial advances in mathematics and astronomy. Al-Razi made groundbreaking discoveries in medicine and chemistry. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, created comprehensive medical and philosophical works that would be used in European universities for centuries. These weren't isolated individual achievements, but part of a systematic scholarly enterprise that advanced human understanding across multiple disciplines. The Abbasid economic system was equally sophisticated, creating what was arguably the world's first global economy. Muslim merchants established trading networks that connected Europe, Africa, and Asia through both overland and maritime routes. The introduction of paper money, derived from Chinese innovations, standardized banking practices, and commercial law created an economic infrastructure that facilitated trade on an unprecedented scale. The famous stories of the Arabian Nights, though compiled later, capture something important about Abbasid commercial culture, the sense that fortunes could be made through trade, that the world was interconnected through commerce, and that wealth and cultural achievement went hand in hand. Baghdad's merchants didn't just import goods, they imported ideas, technologies, and artistic influences from throughout the known world. This commercial prosperity supported not just scholarship but also remarkable achievements in art, architecture, and literature. Abbasid mosques, palaces, and public buildings established architectural styles that would influence Islamic construction for centuries. The distinctive geometric patterns, calligraphic decoration, and sophisticated use of space that characterize Islamic architecture were largely developed during the Abbasid period. The dynasty's approach to governance was equally innovative. The Abbasids developed a complex bureaucratic system that borrowed extensively from Persian administrative traditions while adapting them to Islamic principles. The vizier, chief minister, became a crucial figure in imperial administration, often wielding more day-to-day power than the caliph himself. This system allowed for efficient governance of vast territories while maintaining the caliph's religious authority as leader of the worldwide Muslim community. But the very success of the Abbasid system created new challenges that would ultimately undermine central authority. The empire's vast size made direct control from Baghdad increasingly difficult, particularly as local governors gained more autonomy and resources. The Tulunids in Egypt, the Safavids in eastern Iran, and other regional dynasties began acting as independent rulers while nominally acknowledging Abbasid sovereignty. The Buyid conquest of Baghdad in 945 CE marked a crucial turning point in Abbasid history. The caliph retained his religious authority and symbolic status, but real political power passed to the Buyid emirs, who ruled as military strongmen while maintaining the fiction of Abbasid rule. This arrangement became the model for subsequent periods, when various military dynasties controlled Baghdad, while the Abbasid caliphs served as religious figureheads. The Seljuk Turks, who gained control of Baghdad in 1055 CE, represented another adaptation of this system. The Seljuk sultans exercised military and political authority, while the Abbasid caliphs provided religious legitimacy and maintained the symbolic unity of the Islamic world. This division of powers allowed the caliphate to survive political upheavals while preserving continuity with earlier Islamic traditions. But even as their political power declined, the Abbasids continued to play crucial roles in Islamic intellectual and cultural development. The later Abbasid period saw the flowering of Islamic philosophy with figures like Al-Ghazali and Averroes, the development of new forms of Islamic mysticism, and the creation of educational institutions that would serve as models for later Islamic societies. The Crusades, which began in 1095 CE, presented new challenges but also demonstrated the continued vitality of Islamic civilization under Abbasid leadership. While the Crusaders established several states in the Levant, the Islamic response, coordinated partly through Abbasid diplomatic and religious authority, eventually succeeded in expelling most of the Crusader presence from the Middle East. The final catastrophe came in 1258 CE, when the Mongol forces of Hulagu Khan captured and sacked Baghdad, killing the last effective Abbasid caliph and destroying much of the city's accumulated wealth and learning. The destruction was so complete that Baghdad never fully recovered its former status as the center of Islamic civilization. Yet even this disaster couldn't entirely destroy the Abbasid legacy. The Mamluk sultans of Egypt maintained a line of Abbasid caliphs in Cairo, preserving the symbolic continuity of Islamic leadership. More importantly, the intellectual, cultural, and institutional achievements of the Abbasid period had spread throughout the Islamic world and beyond, influencing development in regions from Spain to India to Southeast Asia. The Abbasid Caliphate had proven that empires could be held together by shared intellectual and cultural achievements as effectively as by military force. They had shown that religious authority and political power could coexist while serving different functions. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that cosmopolitan, multicultural societies could achieve levels of learning, prosperity, and cultural achievement that surpassed anything created by more homogeneous civilizations. Their legacy lived on in the educational institutions they had founded, the scholarly traditions they had established, and the cultural synthesis they had created. The Islamic Golden Age that flourished under Abbasid patronage provided foundations for later developments in science, philosophy, literature, and art that would influence not just the Islamic world, but global human civilization for centuries to come. Mongol Empire. In the early decades of the 13th century, as the Islamic world was reaching new heights of sophistication under the Abbasids and Christian Europe was building its great cathedrals, few people paid much attention to the tribal conflicts occurring on the vast steppes of Mongolia. But those conflicts were producing something unprecedented in human history. The largest contiguous land empire ever created, spanning from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, and transforming every civilization it touched through a combination of military genius, administrative innovation, and cultural synthesis that would reshape the medieval world. The story begins with a young man named Temujin, born around 1162 CE into a minor Mongol tribe in a harsh landscape where survival depended on constant mobility, fierce loyalty, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The traditional narrative of pastoral nomads as primitive barbarians completely misunderstands the sophisticated social and military systems that produced the Mongol Empire. The steppes weren't empty wastelands, but complex ecosystems that required advanced skills in animal husbandry, navigation, logistics, and warfare to master successfully. Temujin's rise to become Genghis Khan wasn't just a story of personal ambition. It was a revolution in steppe politics that unified fractious tribal groups into the most effective military machine the world had ever seen. The great law, Yasa, that Genghis Khan proclaimed, wasn't just a collection of tribal customs but a comprehensive legal and administrative system that created meritocratic institutions, religious tolerance, and standardized military organization across the diverse peoples of the steppes. The key to Mongol military success was their development of the most sophisticated cavalry army in history. Every Mongol warrior was an expert horseman who could accurately shoot a composite bow while riding at full gallop, but this individual skill was magnified through organizational innovations that allowed armies of 100 or more men to coordinate their movements with clockwork precision. The decimal system of military organization, units of 10, 100, 1, 0, and 10, 0 Tumen, created a command structure that could function effectively across vast distances and diverse terrain. But the Mongols were far more than just skilled cavalry. They were master siege engineers who rapidly adopted and improved upon the military technologies of conquered peoples. Chinese siege engines, Muslim incendiary weapons, European crossbow techniques, all were integrated into a Mongol military system that could adapt to any enemy and any terrain. By the time they reached the walls of Baghdad or Kiev, Mongol armies were using sophisticated artillery, engineering corps, and logistical systems that rivaled anything developed by sedentary civilizations. The speed of Mongol expansion was breathtaking even by the standards of previous conquerors. Within 50 years of Genghis Khan's proclamation as Great Khan in 1206, Mongol armies had conquered the Jin and Song dynasties in China, destroyed the Khwarezmid Empire in Central Asia and Iran, devastated the Abbasid Caliphate, overrun the Kievan Rus, and pushed into Poland and Hungary. This represented territorial conquest on a scale that dwarfed anything achieved by Alexander, Caesar, or any other historical conqueror. What made this expansion truly remarkable wasn't just its scope, but the sophisticated administrative systems the Mongols developed to govern their vast empire. Contrary to popular stereotypes about destructive barbarian hordes, the Mongols were brilliant administrators who created the world's most efficient communication network, the most extensive trade system, and one of history's most tolerant approaches to religious and cultural diversity. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, was a marvel of medieval technology and organization. Relay stations positioned every 25-30 miles across the empire allowed official messengers to travel from one end of Mongol territory to the other in a matter of weeks, a communications speed that wouldn't be matched until the development of modern telegraph systems. This network didn't just serve government purposes, it facilitated trade, cultural exchange, and the spread of ideas and technologies across Eurasia on an unprecedented scale. Genghis Khan's approach to religious tolerance was equally revolutionary. Unlike most medieval rulers who used religion as a tool for political unity, the Mongols explicitly protected all religious traditions within their empire. Christian churches, Islamic mosques, Buddhist temples, and Confucian academies all received imperial protection and patronage. This wasn't merely practical tolerance, but a sophisticated understanding that religious diversity could strengthen rather than weaken imperial unity. The Mongol meritocratic system was perhaps even more radical. Traditional Mongol society had been relatively egalitarian compared to the rigid hierarchies of agricultural civilizations, and Genghis Khan extended this principle to imperial administration. Positions of authority were awarded based on ability and loyalty rather than birth or ethnic background. Chinese administrators served alongside Persian bureaucrats and European advisors in a truly international governing class that prioritized competence over traditional social distinctions. Under Ögedei Khan, 1229–1241, Genghis Khan's successor, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent and developed its most sophisticated administrative systems. The construction of Karakorum as the imperial capital created a cosmopolitan center where representatives from every known civilization gathered to participate in Mongol governance. The city featured quarters for different religious communities, markets selling goods from across Eurasia, and a palace where the Great Khan received embassies from kingdoms as distant as France and Egypt. The economic implications of Mongol rule were transformative. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, created the safest and most extensive trade network in human history up to that point. Merchants could travel from Europe to China under the protection of a single legal system, using standardized weights and measures, and relying on imperial guarantees of safe passage. This facilitated not just the exchange of goods, but the transfer of technologies, ideas, and cultural practices that would reshape societies across Eurasia. The Mongols were also great patrons of learning and technology transfer. They systematically relocated craftsmen, scholars, and artists from conquered territories to other parts of their empire, creating unprecedented opportunities for cross-cultural exchange. Chinese printing technology spread to the Middle East, Islamic astronomical instruments reached China, European architectural techniques influenced construction in Central Asia. This technological diffusion accelerated human development in ways that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. However, the very size and diversity of the Mongol Empire contained the seeds of its eventual fragmentation. By the late 13th century, the empire had grown too large to be effectively governed from a single center, and the diverse populations and territories required different administrative approaches that gradually pulled the empire apart. The Great Khan's authority became increasingly theoretical as regional rulers developed independent sources of power and legitimacy. The division of the empire into four khanates, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Iran, the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, represented both practical necessity and the beginning of the end for unified Mongol rule. Each khanate adapted to local conditions, adopted local customs, and gradually lost connection with the others and with their Mongol origins. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, represented perhaps the most successful adaptation of Mongol rule to local conditions. By adopting Chinese governmental practices while maintaining Mongol military traditions, the Yuan created a hybrid system that successfully governed China for nearly a century. Marco Polo's descriptions of Kublai Khan's court reveal a sophisticated civilization that combined Mongol, Chinese, Islamic, and European elements in ways that anticipated modern globalization. The Ilkhanate Iran demonstrated different possibilities for Mongol adaptation. The conversion of Ilkhan Ghazan to Islam in 1295 marked the transformation of Mongol rulers from foreign conquerors into Islamic sovereigns who patronized Persian culture while maintaining their distinctive political traditions. This synthesis created new forms of Islamic art, architecture, and literature that influenced development throughout the Middle East for centuries. But Mongol rule also had devastating consequences that shouldn't be minimized. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258, the devastation of Kiev and Rus, and the demographic catastrophes that accompanied Mongol conquests represented genuine tragedies that set back human development in many regions for centuries. The Mongol approach to warfare, while effective, often involved deliberate terrorism designed to break enemy resistance through fear, a strategy that caused immense suffering even when it achieved its military objectives. The gradual decline of Mongol power in the 14th century came through a combination of internal fragmentation, external pressure, and adaptation to local conditions that ultimately dissolved Mongol identity. As Mongol rulers became Chinese emperors, Islamic sultans, or Orthodox Christian princes, they lost connection with the steppe traditions that had originally made Mongol expansion possible. The Black Death, which spread along Mongol trade routes in the mid-14th century, further weakened the demographic and economic foundations of Mongol rule. By 1368, when the Ming dynasty expelled the Yuan from China, and 1370, when Tamerlane's conquest began fragmenting the Western Khanates, the unified Mongol Empire had ceased to exist. But its legacy proved remarkably durable and influential. The administrative systems developed by the Mongols influenced governance in China, Russia, and the Islamic world for centuries. The trade networks they had created continued to facilitate exchange between Europe and Asia. The cultural synthesis they had fostered produced new forms of art, literature, and technology that enriched civilizations throughout Eurasia. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire had demonstrated that it was possible to create truly global systems of governance, trade, and cultural exchange. They had proven that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness, that meritocracy could be more effective than aristocracy, and that technological and cultural diffusion could accelerate human development in ways that benefited all participants. The Mongol experiment in world empire was relatively brief, lasting only about 150 years in its unified form, but its impact on world history was immeasurable. They had created the first global economy, the first truly international administrative system, and the first example of successful governance across multiple continents and civilizations. In many ways, they had anticipated the interconnected world that would emerge centuries later, proving that human societies could cooperate and prosper together despite vast differences in culture, religion, and social organization. Their legacy reminds us that empires should be measured not just by their military conquests or territorial extent, but by their contributions to human knowledge, cultural exchange, and technological development. The Mongol Empire, despite its violent origins and often brutal methods, ultimately served as a bridge between civilizations, facilitating exchanges that advanced human development and created foundations for the interconnected world we live in today. Section 1. Akkadian Empire. Picture this. It's around 2334 BCE, and somewhere in the dusty corridors of a Sumerian palace, a cup-bearer named Sargon is pouring wine for his king. But Sargon has bigger plans than serving drinks for the rest of eternity. Much bigger plans. Within a few short years, this humble servant would transform himself into the ruler of the world's first true empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. The Akkadian Empire wasn't just another ancient kingdom that happened to get lucky in a few battles. No, this was something entirely new under the sun. For the first time in human history, someone had figured out how to hold together dozens of different cities, tribes, and peoples under a single crown. Sargon didn't just conquer territories and then go home to count his loot. He stayed, he built, he created something that would last. The secret sauce? Innovation on multiple fronts. First, Sargon created the world's first professional standing army. Instead of relying on farmers who picked up spears when trouble came calling, he maintained a permanent force of trained soldiers. These weren't weekend warriors. They were career military men who ate, slept, and breathed warfare. This gave the Akkadians a massive advantage over their neighbors, who were still operating with part-time militias. But military might alone doesn't build empires. Sargon understood that conquest is only half the battle. The real challenge is keeping everything together afterward. So he pioneered something equally revolutionary: imperial infrastructure. The Akkadians built the first systematic network of roads connecting their territories, allowing rapid communication and troop movement across vast distances. Messages that once took weeks to deliver could now travel in days. Even more clever was their linguistic strategy. The Akkadians spoke a Semitic language, quite different from the Sumerian tongues of the cities they conquered. Rather than forcing everyone to abandon their local languages entirely, they established Akkadian as the lingua franca, the common tongue of trade, diplomacy, and administration. This created unity without completely destroying local identity, a delicate balance that many later empires would struggle to achieve. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, took things even further, declaring himself a living god and styling himself as king of the four quarters, essentially claiming dominion over the entire known world. The Akkadians developed a sophisticated bureaucratic system, with governors appointed to oversee distant provinces and regular reports flowing back to the capital. They standardized weights and measures across their territory, making trade more efficient and binding their empire together through economic integration. For nearly 2 centuries, this system worked brilliantly. The Akkadian Empire became the beating heart of Mesopotamian civilization, facilitating trade routes that stretched from Afghanistan to Egypt. Their scribes preserved and transmitted the literary traditions of Sumer, ensuring that masterpieces like the Epic of Gilgamesh would survive for future generations. Their artists developed new styles that blended Sumerian and Semitic influences, creating a distinctive imperial aesthetic. But empires, as we'll see again and again in this story, have a way of carrying the seeds of their own destruction. The Akkadian Empire fell victim to what historians call the imperial overstretch. They simply tried to control too much territory with too few resources. Managing an empire spanning hundreds of miles required constant vigilance, massive bureaucratic machinery, and endless military campaigns to suppress rebellions. Around 2200 BCE, everything started falling apart at once. A severe drought hit the region, causing widespread famine and economic collapse. Archaeological evidence suggests that this wasn't just a bad harvest year. It was a multi-decade climate catastrophe that undermined the agricultural foundation of Akkadian power. Starving populations don't make for loyal subjects, and rebellions erupted across the empire. Meanwhile, the Gutians, a hill people from the Zagros Mountains, began launching increasingly bold raids into Mesopotamian heartland. These weren't the kind of organized invasions that the Akkadian military was designed to handle. They were fast-moving guerrilla attacks that struck quickly and melted away before reinforcements arrived. The professional army that had been so effective at conquest proved less adaptable to this new kind of warfare. The final blow came from within. Succession disputes weakened the royal family, and provincial governors began acting more like independent kings than loyal administrators. The centralized system that had been the empire's greatest strength became its fatal weakness when the center could no longer hold. By 2154 BCE, the Akkadian Empire had crumbled completely, its territories fragmenting back into independent city-states. But its legacy lived on. The Akkadians had proven that vast multi-ethnic empires were possible, and they'd developed many of the basic tools: professional armies, bureaucratic administration, infrastructure networks, linguistic policies that future empire builders would refine and expand upon. Mali Empire. Picture this. It's the 13th century, and while European knights are trudging through muddy fields arguing about who gets to be king of which particular patch of turnips, something far more magnificent is taking shape in West Africa. The Mali Empire is about to become so wealthy that one man's religious pilgrimage will literally crash the Egyptian economy for a decade. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Our story begins with Sundiata Keita, whose life reads like something between a Disney movie and a Game of Thrones episode, minus the unnecessary dragon budget. According to the epic oral tradition that griots still sing today, Sundiata was born unable to walk, dismissed by his father's court as weak and worthless. His mother, Sogolon, was allegedly a hunchbacked woman with supernatural powers, because apparently even medieval Africa understood that the most interesting characters come with tragic backstories and mysterious parentage. When civil war erupted after his father's death, Sundiata was forced into exile, where he supposedly gained the ability to walk and developed into a formidable leader. Whether or not you believe the magical realism elements, and honestly, after covering 15 previous empires, talking animals and prophetic dreams are starting to feel perfectly reasonable. What matters is that Sundiata returned to unite the fragmented Mandinka clans into something unprecedented. The Mali Empire wasn't built through conquest alone, though there was plenty of that. It was constructed on something far more durable, an intricate web of kinship obligations, trade relationships, and religious tolerance that would make modern diplomats weep with envy. Sundiata established the Mandan Charter, essentially a constitution that protected women's rights, abolished slavery within the empire, and guaranteed religious freedom centuries before Europeans got around to pretending they invented these concepts. But here's where Mali gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean stupendously, almost offensively wealthy. The empire controlled the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure, along with the salt mines of Tagaza. And if you think that sounds boring, you clearly don't understand medieval economics. Gold and salt were literally worth their weight in, well, gold and salt. Salt was so valuable that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in it, hence the phrase worth his salt, and Mali had both commodities in abundance. The trans-Saharan trade routes became Mali's economic arteries, with caravans carrying up to 12 camels crossing the desert loaded with goods that would make Amazon's logistics network look quaint. These weren't just pack animals wandering aimlessly across sand dunes. This was a sophisticated commercial operation with rest stops, security escorts, and what amounted to medieval customs houses. Timbuktu, Jenne, and Gao became cosmopolitan centers where Arabic, Mandinka, Berber, and dozens of other languages mixed in markets that stayed open well past any reasonable bedtime. Timbuktu, in particular, became synonymous with learning and scholarship. The University of Sankore attracted students from across the Islamic world, with libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on everything from astronomy to poetry. While European universities were still debating how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, Timbuktu scholars were performing eye surgery and calculating the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Which brings us to Mansa Musa, whose 1,324 pilgrimage to Mecca remains one of history's most spectacular displays of wealth. Musa didn't just go on Hajj, he turned it into the medieval equivalent of a hip-hop music video, complete with a caravan of 60 people, 80 camels carrying gold dust, and enough bling to blind anyone unfortunate enough to look directly at his procession. When Musa reached Cairo, he distributed so much gold to the poor, bought so many souvenirs, and paid such ridiculous prices for everything that he single-handedly caused inflation that lasted 10 years. The price of gold in Egypt didn't recover until the 1330s. Imagine being so wealthy that your vacation spending habits destabilize an entire region's economy. That's Mansa Musa-level money. European mapmakers, who had previously drawn Africa as a vague blob inhabited by mythical creatures and their own geographical ignorance, suddenly started paying attention. The 1375 Catalan Atlas depicts Musa sitting on a throne, holding a gold nugget, with the caption, "This Negro lord is called Musa Mali. So abundant is the gold in his country that he is the richest and most noble king in all the land." But empires built on trade routes are vulnerable to shifting commercial winds. By the late 15th century, Portuguese exploration of the Atlantic coast began diverting trade away from trans-Saharan routes. The Songhai Empire, once Mali's eastern vassal, grew powerful enough to challenge its former overlord, capturing Timbuktu in 1468. Meanwhile, Tuareg nomads pressed from the north, gradually eroding Mali's control over its desert territories. The empire didn't collapse dramatically like some historical dominoes. It slowly contracted, like a medieval financial bubble deflating over centuries rather than months. By 1600, Mali had shrunk back to roughly its original Mandinka heartland, wealthy enough to matter locally but no longer the continental power that had once made Egyptian economists nervous. Ottoman Empire. Now we turn to an empire that lasted so long it makes your great-grandmother's marriage look like a brief summer romance. The Ottoman Empire endured for over 6 centuries, from 1299 to 1922, spanning 3 continents and somehow managing to remain relevant through the medieval period, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and well into the age of airplanes and telegraphs. If empires had LinkedIn profiles, the Ottomans would have the most impressive career longevity section in history. The story begins with Osman I, a Turkish tribal leader, whose name would eventually grace one of history's most successful political franchises. But calling the early Ottomans merely Turkish misses the point. They were Ghazis, frontier warriors motivated by a potent mixture of Islamic faith, economic opportunity, and what can only be described as medieval startup energy. These weren't settled farmers deciding to become conquerors. They were already militarized nomads who had perfected the art of expansion through a combination of military skill and administrative pragmatism. What made the Ottomans different from countless other would-be empire builders was their remarkable ability to absorb and adapt. Take the Janissary Corps, arguably the most innovative military institution of the late medieval period. Most armies of the time relied on feudal levies or mercenaries, essentially asking farmers to drop their plows and pick up swords, or hiring professional soldiers whose loyalty lasted exactly as long as their paychecks. The Ottomans created something entirely different through the devshirme system, a practice that sounds absolutely horrifying to modern sensibilities but worked with ruthless efficiency for centuries. They collected boys from Christian families across the Balkans, converted them to Islam, and trained them as elite soldiers and administrators. These janissaries were legally slaves, but slaves who could rise to become viziers, generals, and architects of imperial policy. It was social mobility through conscription, creating a military elite whose loyalty belonged entirely to the Sultan rather than to local nobles or tribal allegiances. The system produced men like Mimar Sinan, the son of a Greek Orthodox stonemason who became Islam's greatest architect, or Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, a Bosnian shepherd's son who served as Grand Vizier for 15 years. The Ottomans had essentially weaponized meritocracy, creating an administrative class that owed everything to the empire and nothing to traditional power structures. This institutional innovation reached its spectacular climax in 1453, when 21-year-old Mehmed II decided to do what countless others had attempted for over 1,000 years: conquer Constantinople. The city had withstood Arab sieges, survived the Fourth Crusade's sack, and remained the last flickering ember of the Roman Empire through various disasters, plagues, and military catastrophes that would have ended any reasonable civilization several times over. Mehmed's siege wasn't just another medieval assault. It was a masterclass in logistics, engineering, and psychological warfare. He had Hungarian engineer Orbán cast the largest cannon ever built, a bronze monster that could fire 600-pound stone balls over a mile. When the massive chain blocking the Golden Horn proved impossible to break, Mehmed had his ships carried overland on greased logs, launching them behind the Byzantine defences in what amounts to the naval equivalent of a magic trick. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe and established the Ottomans as the Islamic world's premier power, but conquest was only the beginning. The real genius lay in what came next. Rather than attempting to Turkishify their vast territories, the Ottomans created the millet system, allowing religious communities to govern themselves according to their own laws while remaining loyal to the Sultan. Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Jews, and various Eastern Christian sects maintained their religious autonomy under appointed leaders who answered to Constantinople. It wasn't religious freedom, as we understand it today, but it was a remarkably tolerant arrangement for its time, particularly when compared to contemporary European practices of burning heretics and expelling entire populations based on their prayer preferences. Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566, represented the empire at its absolute zenith. Europeans called him the Magnificent, but Ottomans knew him as Kanuni, the lawgiver, reflecting their priorities. While European monarchs were busy posing for portraits and starting wars over inheritance disputes, Suleiman was systematically codifying Ottoman law, reorganizing the government, and commissioning architectural projects that still make visitors to Istanbul question their life choices. His legal reforms, known as the Kanun, created a parallel system alongside Islamic law that governed everything from taxation to criminal procedure. The Ottomans had essentially created a dual legal framework that could adapt to local conditions while maintaining imperial unity. Imagine trying to explain that concept to medieval European lawyers who were still arguing about whether trial by combat constituted due process. Suleiman's military campaigns pushed Ottoman borders to their greatest extent, with his armies reaching the gates of Vienna in 1529. The siege failed, but the psychological impact resonated across Europe for centuries. Ottoman naval power dominated the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, challenging Portuguese and later Dutch commercial supremacy while maintaining profitable relationships with Venice and other Italian city-states. The Ottoman economic system was built on pragmatic exploitation of geography and resources. Constantinople controlled the Bosphorus, making it the unavoidable checkpoint for trade between Europe and Asia. The empire collected customs duties on goods flowing in both directions, while maintaining internal commercial networks that connected the Black Sea to the Red Sea, the Danube to the Euphrates. But success bred complacency, and by the 17th century, cracks were beginning to show. The discovery of sea routes to Asia reduced the importance of overland trade routes that had enriched the empire for centuries. European military technology, particularly in artillery and naval warfare, began outpacing Ottoman innovations. The Janissary Corps, once the empire's greatest strength, became a conservative political force resistant to military reforms. The 18th and 19th centuries brought the Eastern Question, European powers' endless diplomatic maneuvering over how to divide Ottoman territories without triggering a general war. The empire became the sick man of Europe, propped up by shifting alliances designed to maintain the balance of power rather than Ottoman strength. Nationalist movements across the Balkans and Arab provinces challenged the millet system's effectiveness, while capitulations, commercial privileges granted to European merchants, undermined Ottoman economic sovereignty. The empire survived through a combination of diplomatic skill, European rivalries, and periodic attempts at modernization that never quite managed to reverse the underlying decline. World War I provided the final blow. Ottoman entry on the German side proved catastrophic, leading to military defeats, economic collapse, and the empire's partition among Allied powers. Mustafa Kemal, Ataturk's Turkish Republic, rose from the empire's Anatolian heartland, but the Ottoman era had definitively ended, leaving behind architectural marvels, legal traditions, and the memory of an empire that had bridged Europe, Asia, and Africa for over 6 centuries. Ming Dynasty China. After the Mongols had spent roughly a century demonstrating that you can conquer China, but governing it requires an entirely different skill set, a peasant named Zhu Yuanzhang decided he could do better. This might sound like historical hubris of the highest order, peasants declaring they can outgovern the descendants of Genghis Khan, but Zhu had something the Yuan dynasty had gradually lost: the ability to read the room, politically speaking. The Yuan dynasty's final decades resembled a slow-motion governmental collapse, with natural disasters, currency devaluation, and administrative corruption creating the perfect conditions for rebellion. When multiple peasant uprisings erupted simultaneously across China, Zhu Yuanzhang emerged from this chaos not through superior military tactics alone, but by understanding something fundamental about Chinese political culture. Legitimacy comes from effective governance, not just military conquest. Zhu, who would become the Hongwu Emperor, founded the Ming dynasty in 1368 with a restoration agenda that was part conservative reaction and part radical reform. He abolished the traditional prime minister position, centralizing power in the emperor while simultaneously decentralizing administration through a system of prefectures and counties that reported directly to Beijing. It was constitutional monarchy without the monarchy part, imperial authoritarianism with bureaucratic efficiency. His agrarian reforms addressed the fundamental problem that had destabilized every Chinese dynasty: land distribution. The Ming cadastral surveys redistributed property from wealthy landlords to small farmers, created state farms for military colonies, and established a taxation system based on silver payments rather than grain tribute. This wasn't communist collectivization, but it was systematic wealth redistribution on a scale that would make modern economists nervous. The Confucian revival under the Ming represented more than just cultural nostalgia. It was a comprehensive rejection of Mongol administrative practices in favor of Chinese scholarly traditions. The civil service examination system was restored and expanded, creating a meritocracy based on classical literary knowledge rather than military prowess or aristocratic birth. Thousands of young men spent years memorizing poetry and philosophy, competing for positions in a bureaucracy that valued elegant prose over practical experience. This system produced remarkably educated administrators who could quote Mencius from memory, but sometimes struggled with basic economic policy. It was like staffing the Treasury Department entirely with philosophy professors, intellectually impressive, but occasionally disconnected from practical governance challenges. Which brings us to one of history's most fascinating might-have-beens: the treasure fleets of Admiral Zheng He. Between 1405 and 1433, these expeditions represented China at the peak of naval technology and maritime ambition. Zheng He's flagship was reportedly over 400 feet long, making Columbus's Santa Maria look like a pleasure craft. His fleets included 28 crew members, carried enough supplies for multi-year voyages, and projected Chinese power from Southeast Asia to the eastern coast of Africa. These weren't exploratory missions in the European sense. They were diplomatic expeditions designed to establish Chinese suzerainty over maritime trade routes. Zheng He's fleets demanded tribute from local rulers, established Chinese trading posts, and demonstrated imperial power through sheer logistical impressiveness. When the king of Ceylon proved insufficiently respectful, Zheng He simply kidnapped him and took him back to Beijing for attitude adjustment. But then, in one of history's most consequential policy reversals, the Ming court abandoned these maritime expeditions entirely. The Yongle emperor's successors viewed the treasure fleets as expensive vanity projects that diverted resources from more pressing concerns, particularly nomadic threats along the northern border. China retreated from the seas just as Portuguese explorers were beginning their own age of maritime expansion. This decision shaped world history in ways the Ming court never anticipated. Portuguese control of the Indian Ocean trade, Dutch commercial expansion in Southeast Asia, and eventual European colonization of maritime Asia all occurred in the vacuum left by Chinese withdrawal. China remained the world's largest economy, but it was a continental rather than maritime power, leaving ocean trade to smaller, more aggressive European competitors. The Ming response to this strategic challenge was characteristically Chinese. They built a wall. Not just any wall. The Great Wall, as we know it today, is largely a Ming construction project, a 13-0-mile fortification system that represented the world's most expensive defense budget item until the 20th century. Previous dynasties had built walls, but the Ming created an integrated system of fortresses, watchtowers, and garrison towns designed to keep nomadic raiders permanently on the wrong side of the border. The wall worked, sort of. Major invasions became impossible, but it also created a massive ongoing expense that strained imperial finances for centuries. Every emperor inherited a wall that needed constant maintenance, regular upgrading, and permanent staffing. It was like buying a house and discovering that the homeowners association fees exceeded your mortgage payments. Meanwhile, Spanish silver from the Americas was transforming the global economy, and China became the ultimate destination for this new world wealth. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea were in such demand that European merchants paid for them almost entirely in silver, creating the world's first truly global currency system. Silver flowed from Potosi through Spanish galleons to Manila, then on Chinese junks to Beijing, where it monetized the imperial economy and enabled population growth that reached 150 million by 1600. But silver-based prosperity created new vulnerabilities. Inflation became chronic as increased money supply outpaced economic growth. Court eunuchs, who controlled access to the emperor, became powerful political players whose factional struggles paralyzed policy-making. The Wanli emperor, who ruled for 47 years, essentially went on strike for the last decade of his reign, refusing to hold court or make appointments in what amounted to an imperial passive-aggressive episode that destabilized the entire government. The early 17th century brought the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that devastated Chinese agriculture. Crop failures triggered famines, famines sparked rebellions, and rebellions exposed the dynasty's military weakness. Li Zicheng's peasant army captured Beijing in 1644, but their victory proved brief when Manchu forces invaded from the northeast, offering to restore order in exchange for political control. The Ming dynasty's collapse wasn't caused by external invasion alone, but by the intersection of climate change, fiscal crisis, and political dysfunction that made effective response impossible. The Manchus, who established the Qing dynasty, ruled China for another 268 years, but the Ming period had established cultural and administrative patterns that would influence Chinese civilization through the 20th century and beyond. Spanish Empire. Picture, if you will, the year 1492, while the last Muslim stronghold of Granada falls to Christian forces in Iberia, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus stands before Queen Isabella, clutching maps that promise a western route to the spice-rich Indies. The Portuguese have already claimed the African route around the Cape of Good Hope, leaving Spain desperately seeking its own path to Asian wealth. Columbus, armed with wildly inaccurate calculations about the Earth's circumference, convinces the Catholic monarchs that China lies just 3,000 miles west across the Atlantic. He's wrong by roughly 10,000 miles, but this miscalculation will reshape the world. On October 12th, 1492, Columbus's 3 ships reach what he believes to be the outer islands of Asia. Instead, he has stumbled upon the Caribbean, initiating contact between 2 worlds that have evolved separately for millennia. The Taino people who greet him live in a paradise of coral reefs and tropical abundance, organized into chiefdoms that span the Greater Antilles. They offer gifts of gold ornaments, not knowing they've just sealed their civilization's doom. Columbus, seeing their generosity and apparent military weakness, writes in his journal that 50 men could subdue them all. He's established the template for everything that follows. The Spanish conquistadors who arrive in subsequent decades are not mere adventurers but products of the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule. They've been hardened by warfare, motivated by religious zeal and attracted by rumors of cities paved with gold. Hernán Cortés lands in Mexico in 1519 with just 600 men, yet within 2 years he's toppled the Aztec Empire that ruled 15 million people. Francisco Pizarro accomplishes something similar in Peru, capturing the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in 1532 and dismantling an empire that stretched along the entire western spine of South America. Encomienda labor system. The Spanish crown faces an immediate dilemma: how to extract wealth from territories larger than Europe itself, while maintaining the fiction that indigenous peoples are free subjects rather than slaves. The solution is the encomienda system, a legal arrangement that grants Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and labor from specific indigenous communities in exchange for providing protection and Christian instruction. On paper, it's presented as a feudal compact. In practice, it becomes a mechanism for systematic exploitation that decimates native populations. Under encomienda, entire communities find themselves bound to work Spanish mines, plantations, and ranches without wages. The tribute demands are crushing communities must provide not only labor, but also specified quantities of gold, silver, textiles, or agricultural products. Those who resist face violent punishment. The Spanish justify this system through the legal framework of the Requerimiento, a document read aloud to indigenous groups demanding they submit to Spanish rule and Christian conversion. If they refuse or fail to understand this Spanish proclamation, they can be enslaved with a clear conscience. The demographic collapse that follows is staggering. Disease accounts for much of the mortality. Smallpox, typhus, and measles sweep through populations with no immunity to old-world pathogens. But overwork, malnutrition, and violence under the encomienda system accelerate the catastrophe. The indigenous population of central Mexico plummets from an estimated 15 million in 1519 to just 1 million by 1600. Similar collapses occur throughout Spanish America, creating a labor shortage that will eventually be filled by enslaved Africans, adding another layer of suffering to the colonial economy. Manila galleons, global trade. By the 1570s, Spanish ambitions have expanded beyond the Americas to embrace the entire Pacific Ocean. The establishment of Manila in the Philippines creates an unprecedented opportunity, a direct trade route connecting Asian luxury goods with American silver. The Manila galleon trade becomes the world's first truly global commerce network, linking 4 continents in a cycle of exchange that will persist for 2.5 centuries. Every year, 1 or 2 massive galleons depart Acapulco, loaded with silver from Mexican and Peruvian mines. These floating treasure houses carry up to 2 million pesos in silver coins and bars across 6,000 miles of Pacific Ocean to Manila, where Chinese merchants eagerly exchange this precious metal for silk, porcelain, spices, and manufactured goods that European artisans cannot match. The return voyage brings these Asian luxuries to Mexico, where they're either consumed locally by wealthy colonists or shipped across to Spain via the Caribbean treasure fleets. The galleons themselves are engineering marvels, some of the largest wooden ships ever built, displacing up to 2,000 tons and requiring crews of several hundred men. The westward journey takes 3 to 4 months, following the trade winds and North Pacific currents. The return trip is even more perilous, sailing far north to catch the California current before turning south to Acapulco. Pirates, storms, and the simple vastness of the Pacific make each voyage a gamble with death. Ships are frequently lost, taking fortunes in silver and silk to the ocean floor. This trans-Pacific trade transforms global economics. Chinese demand for silver drives increased mining in the Americas, while American silver flows into China, monetizing the world's largest economy and enabling population growth that will make China home to 1/3 of humanity by 1800. European markets flood with Asian goods, creating new patterns of consumption and desire that fuel further colonial expansion. Potosi silver boom, European price revolution. In 1545, indigenous workers discover silver deposits on a mountain in what is now Bolivia that will become the most productive mine in human history. Cerro Rico, the rich hill of Potosi, contains silver veins so pure and extensive that the city built to exploit them grows to rival London and Paris in population. By 1600, Potosi is home to 160 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world, sustained entirely by the brutal extraction of precious metal from the mountain's depths. The scale of silver production at Potosi defies comprehension. Using indigenous labor drafted through the Mita System, a colonial adaptation of Inca labor obligations, Spanish operators extract ore that's processed using mercury amalgamation techniques learned from German mining experts. The human cost is appalling. Workers descend into airless shafts, hundreds of feet deep, carrying heavy loads of ore up precarious ladders, their lives shortened by mercury poisoning and silicosis. An estimated 8 million people die in Potosi's mines over 3 centuries of operation. But the silver that flows from this mountain of death transforms the European economy. Between 1,500 and 1,650, Spanish America produces roughly 150 tons of silver, tripling the world's supply of precious metals. This influx triggers what economists call the price revolution, as the increased money supply drives inflation throughout Europe. Prices rise 3 to 4 times over the course of the 16th century, disrupting traditional economic relationships and creating new patterns of wealth and poverty. The silver boom enables Spain to finance its European wars and maintain its global empire, but it also creates dangerous dependencies. Spanish manufacturers cannot compete with cheaper goods from Northern Europe and Asia, leading to a paradox where the world's largest silver producer becomes increasingly indebted to foreign suppliers. By 1600, Spanish silver flows immediately to German bankers, Dutch merchants, and Chinese traders, passing through Spanish hands without significantly developing Spanish industry. Habsburg-Bourbon administrative shifts. Jesuit missions. The Spanish Empire's administration evolved significantly over its 4-century lifespan, particularly after the War of Spanish Succession brings the Bourbon dynasty to power in 1700. The Habsburgs had governed through a complex system of viceroyalties, audiencias, and local officials who often operated with considerable autonomy due to the sheer distances involved in transatlantic communication. The Bourbons, influenced by French administrative models, attempt to centralize control and increase efficiency through the Bourbon reforms of the 18th century. These reforms reorganize colonial administration, create new viceroyalties, and attempt to reduce the power of Creole elites, American-born descendants of Spanish settlers who have accumulated significant local influence. The reforms also target the Catholic Church's enormous wealth and autonomy, particularly the Jesuit order, whose missions throughout Spanish America have created virtually independent states within the empire. The Jesuit missions represent one of the most remarkable experiments in colonial history. From Paraguay to California, Jesuit priests establish communities that protect indigenous peoples from enslavement, while introducing European agricultural techniques, crafts, and religious practices. The Paraguayan reductions shelter 100 Guarani people in 30 missions, creating a unique synthesis of indigenous and European cultures. However, the Jesuit success breeds resentment among colonial settlers who covet indigenous labor and their mission lands. In 1767, King Charles III expels the Jesuits from all Spanish territories, confiscating their properties and scattering their indigenous converts. This decision, part of broader Bourbon attempts to reduce church power, eliminates one of the empire's most effective institutions for managing indigenous relations and frontier defense, creating instabilities that will contribute to the empire's eventual collapse. Portuguese Empire. Picture, if you will, the windswept cliffs of Sagres, where Europe's Atlantic edge meets the endless ocean. Here, in the early 15th century, a Portuguese prince with dreams larger than his small kingdom would set in motion events that would reshape the world. Prince Henry, whom history would call the navigator, though he himself never sailed beyond Morocco's coast, established something unprecedented, a school dedicated to the science of exploration. Within the walls of his fortress observatory, Henry gathered an extraordinary collection of mines. Jewish cartographers fled from persecution, bringing ancient maps and astronomical knowledge. Italian navigators shared Mediterranean sailing techniques. Arab scholars contributed their mathematical precision to the art of navigation. Here, beneath Portugal's salt-tinged air, they refined the caravel, that nimble ship with triangular sails that could sail closer to the wind than any vessel before it. They perfected the astrolabe, that bronze disk that could read the stars' positions and translate them into earthly coordinates. Most importantly, they methodically mapped the African coast, pushing southward expedition by expedition, cape by cape. Henry's motivations were wonderfully complex, as human ambitions often are. Yes, there was gold rumors of West African kingdoms rich beyond European imagination. There was the legendary Prester John, that mythical Christian king supposedly ruling somewhere in Africa or Asia, waiting to ally with fellow Christians against Islamic powers. There was the simple burning curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. And there was Portugal's peculiar position, a small kingdom pressed against the Atlantic, unable to expand eastward into Spain, forced to look seaward for its destiny. The breakthrough came in 1488, when Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that Africa had an end, that the Indian Ocean was not an enclosed sea. But it was Vasco da Gama's voyage a decade later that truly opened the floodgates. In 1498, after months navigating by stars and currents, da Gama's ships limped into the port of Calicut, their hulls heavy with the promise of unimaginable wealth. What da Gama discovered was not an empty ocean, but a thriving maritime world. The Indian Ocean pulsed with trade. Arab doughs carried spices and silk, Chinese junks transported porcelain and tea, Indian merchants dealt in precious stones and textiles. Into this ancient commercial network, the Portuguese inserted themselves not as conquerors of land, but as controllers of sea lanes. They built fortresses at strategic choke points, Hormuz controlling the Persian Gulf, Socotra guarding the Red Sea entrance, Colombo dominating Ceylon's cinnamon trade. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Portugal was laying different foundations. The sugar islands Madeira, the Azores, São Tomé became laboratories for a plantation system that would spread across the Americas. Here, Portuguese entrepreneurs experimented with large-scale agriculture using enslaved labor, primarily Africans captured or purchased along the West African coast. The profits were extraordinary, the human cost incalculable. These Atlantic ventures financed the Indian Ocean Empire and established Portugal as Europe's first systematic participant in the slave trade. The Estado de India, Portugal's Indian Ocean Empire, stretched from Mozambique to Macau, connected not by territorial control, but by a network of fortified trading posts. Goa became its jewel, a slice of Europe transplanted to India's Konkan coast, complete with churches, convents, and colonial mansions. From Goa, Portuguese merchants and missionaries spread eastward to Malacca, controlling the vital strait between the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, to Macau, their precarious foothold in the Chinese trading system, to Nagasaki, where they introduced firearms and Christianity to Japan. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 had theoretically divided the world between Spain and Portugal, but reality proved messier than papal decrees. Portuguese traders operated in the grey zones, their success depending more on local alliances and naval superiority than on distant European agreements. They married into local merchant families, converted local rulers when possible, and adapted to local customs when necessary. Yet this maritime empire carried the seeds of its own decline. Portugal's population was simply too small to effectively control such vast distances. The Dutch, with their superior financial systems and larger merchant marine, began systematically capturing Portuguese strongholds in the early 17th century. The British, arriving later but with greater industrial backing, gradually displaced Portuguese influence throughout the Indian Ocean. By the 18th century, Portugal's empire had contracted to Brazil, a few African colonies, and scattered Asian enclaves. The final chapter didn't close until 1999, when MacArthur's last fragment of Europe's first global empire was handed back to China. In those final moments, as Portuguese flags were lowered for the last time in Asia, 5 centuries of maritime adventure came to their quiet end. Mughal Empire. In the early morning mist of April 1526, the thunder of cannons echoed across the plains of Panipat, forever changing the destiny of the Indian subcontinent. Babur, a descendant of both Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, stood watching as his revolutionary use of gunpowder artillery shattered the massive war elephants of Sultan Ibrahim Lodi. The age of the Mughal Empire had begun, not with the clash of traditional swords, but with the roar of Ottoman-inspired cannons that would reshape an entire civilization. Babur was no stranger to conquest and loss. This restless prince had already won and lost Samarkand 3 times before his 20th birthday, each victory teaching him harsh lessons about the fragility of power. When he finally turned his ambitious gaze toward Hindustan, he brought with him not just the military innovations of the Islamic world, but also a poetic soul that would find beauty in the gardens of his new empire. His memoir, the Baburnama, captures both the strategic brilliance and the melancholic longing of a man who conquered lands but never truly felt at home in them. The victory at Panipat was more than a military triumph. It was a technological revolution that introduced the Indian subcontinent to the devastating efficiency of coordinated artillery and matchlock firearms. Babur's forces, though vastly outnumbered, demonstrated how disciplined use of gunpowder weapons could overcome traditional cavalry charges and elephant-based warfare that had dominated the region for centuries. But it would be Babur's grandson, Akbar, who truly transformed this military conquest into one of history's most remarkable experiments in imperial governance. Ascending to the throne at 13, Akbar would spend the next 50 years crafting a vision of empire that was both breathtakingly ambitious and surprisingly tolerant for its time. Where other conquerors imposed their faith and culture through force, Akbar chose a different pathone that would earn him the title Akbar the Great and create a golden age that still glimmers in our collective memory. The young emperor's approach to his diverse subjects was revolutionary. Rather than ruling as a Muslim sultan over Hindu subjects, Akbar abolished the discriminatory jizya tax on non-Muslims and actively recruited Hindu, Sikh, and Parsi nobles into his administration. His court became a dazzling fusion of Persian elegance, Indian artistry, and Islamic scholarship, where debates between different religious traditions were not just tolerated but actively encouraged. The famous Ibadat Khana, or House of Worship, hosted theological discussions that would have been unthinkable in most other empires of the era. This wasn't mere political calculation, though. Akbar was certainly a shrewd politician. The emperor genuinely believed in creating a new synthesis, a Dini-Ilahi, or divine faith, that attempted to merge the best insights from Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. While this philosophical experiment never gained widespread acceptance, it reflected Akbar's extraordinary vision of an empire united not by shared faith, but by shared prosperity and mutual respect. The Persianate court culture that flourished under Akbar created artistic achievements that still take our breath away. Miniature painting reached new heights of refinement, blending Persian techniques with Indian sensibilities to create works of stunning beauty. The architectural innovations of this period, combining Islamic geometric patterns with Hindu decorative traditions, would culminate in masterpieces that still draw millions of visitors centuries later. Akbar's administrative genius was equally impressive. The Mansabdari system he developed created a meritocratic hierarchy where nobles were ranked by their military obligations and administrative responsibilities. Revenue surveys mapped the empire's agricultural potential with unprecedented precision, creating a tax system that was both efficient and relatively fair. The empire's roads buzzed with merchants, scholars, and pilgrims, while the imperial mint produced standardized currency that facilitated trade from Bengal to Gujarat. Under Akbar's successors, the empire reached its zenith of cultural achievement. Shah Jahan, the king of the world, transformed the Mughal capital into a paradise of marble and precious stones. The Taj Mahal, that eternal poem in white marble, was built not just as a tomb for his beloved wife Mumtaz, but as a statement of imperial power that could command the resources to create beauty on such an otherworldly scale. The Red Fort in Delhi, with its intricate inlay work and perfect proportions, showcased the heights of Indo-Islamic architecture. But this golden age contained the seeds of its own destruction. Shah Jahan's son, Aurangzeb, abandoned his great-grandfather's tolerant policies in favor of orthodox Islamic governance. The reimposition of the jizya tax, the destruction of several prominent Hindu temples, and the persecution of Sikh gurus created fractures in the diverse empire that Akbar had so carefully constructed. Aurangzeb's military campaigns expanded Mughal territory to its greatest extent, stretching from Kashmir to the Deccan, but these conquests came at an enormous cost in both treasure and goodwill. The emperor's long wars in the Deccan against the Maratha Confederacy proved particularly draining. Shivaji and his successors had mastered guerrilla warfare perfectly suited to the rocky terrain of the Western Ghats, bleeding the Mughal armies white through constant raids and ambushes. While Aurangzeb's forces could capture forts and cities, they could never quite eliminate the elusive Maratha horsemen, who seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish like mountain mist. Meanwhile, new challenges emerged from other directions. The Sikh community, galvanized by the execution of their ninth guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur, transformed from a peaceful religious sect into a formidable military brotherhood. In Punjab, the Khalsa armies proved that the Mughal military machine was no longer invincible. But perhaps the most insidious threat came from an unexpected direction: European trading companies that had initially seemed like minor players in the empire's vast economy. The British East India Company, originally content to establish small trading posts along the coast, began to exploit the empire's internal divisions. Using their superior naval power and diplomatic cunning, they played different factions against each other while gradually expanding their own territorial control. The Mughal Empire's final century was a long, melancholy decline. Emperors became puppets of their own nobles, then puppets of the British. The last emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was more poet than ruler, writing verses that captured the bittersweet end of a dynasty that had once commanded the loyalty of 100 million people. When the British finally exiled him to Rangoon after the failed uprising of 1857, an empire that had lasted over 3 centuries quietly slipped into history, leaving behind monuments that still inspire wonder and a legacy of cultural synthesis that enriched the world in ways we're still discovering today.